All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Judicial Proceedings Committee. Today is January 15th, 2025. We are here to receive a briefing from the Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability. It's an evaluation of the Department of Juvenile Services. And so we're going to start off with Director Michael Powell and Senior Program Evaluator Diana Winter. Before we get into the kind of the sum and substance of the report, I want to just say thank you for your work here. Obviously, juvenile crime has been top of mind for all of us here in the Judicial Proceedings Committee. And while national trends for violent crime, both adults and juveniles, have been trending in the right direction for quite some time, and that's true here in Maryland as well, there have been significant spikes in areas which must be addressed, and it is obviously a top public safety concern of all of our constituents. So I also want to thank the Department of Juvenile Services and their Secretary Vinnie Schiraldi, for being here and for your presence and for your work. And we look forward to hearing from you after the report from OPEGA. And then finally, I'll just say this. As legislators looking to make good policy to make Marylanders safer, we oftentimes run into the frustration of lack of good information and fidelity of information. I found that even when you ask the right questions, it's really hard to get the right information or good information or timely information or accurate information. And if you ask the wrong questions, you're always going to get the wrong answers. You all have asked a lot of the right questions in this report. And so we are tremendously thankful for the work that you've done. And so with that, I'll just say thank you, Director Powell, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the committee. My name is Mike Powell. I'm the Director of the Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability. We're in the Department of Legislative Services. I'm joined by Diana Winter on our staff and a couple of other folks from our office that worked on this report we're going to present to you. And there's been some confusion when we've presented for some other committees, so I just want to be clear. We don't work for DJS. We're not contractors or consultants. We work for you. We're nonpartisan, objective, sort of fact-based staff that was asked by or directed by the Joint Audit and Evaluation Committee to do this evaluation of the performance of the Department of Juvenile Services. This is a little longer than I would normally go, but I think we're probably looking at about 30 minutes of me today, and I'm happy to take questions after that. And then I know DJS and Secretary Schiraldi are here to respond after we're done. And if we can go to slide... if we can advance the slides, or am I doing that? This is DJS's that's up.
There you go, and you can just, yep, hit that one.
Thanks, sorry about that. So when we were asked to do this, we spoke to a number of stakeholders, and we decided that we were going to look into 4 different things. The first of that is the effectiveness of contractual community-based services and service providers. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a minute. And then we wanted to look at DJS's oversight of these contractors that are working with DJS-involved kids in the community. The third thing, which is different, is what's going on with SINs, or children in need of supervision. And then finally, we looked into the case histories of a small number of youth who had been charged in a series of armed robberies and armed carjackings. But our first chapter of the report, we just wanted to sort of show the long-term trends in juvenile justice in Maryland. And on this slide, you can see, are you guys able to see this too? That orange line is the number of complaints to DJS per month, and you can see recently that's about 1,000 that they get. It is
I'll tap dance a little bit while we do this. Look, I'll just say that obviously this report is really important, and the presentation that follows is really important. We're going to entertain a lot of reforms, and we have entertained a lot of reforms in the juvenile justice system over the last couple of years. A lot of what we hope to do is going to be informed by, some of the answers to the questions that are posed in this report, and some of the work that needs to be done through the Department of Juvenile Services moving forward. So, really looking forward to the information inside. There you go. All right, burned enough time. There you go.
Thanks. So if you go back 10 years, DJS might get 3,000 of these a month. Recently, it's just a little over 1,000. And I want to point out that terminology and jargons gets complicated with DJS. And there are terms like referral, intake, and complaint that all generally mean the same thing. So what we're talking about is a kid being brought to DJS. Typically, they're brought by a police officer probably over 90% of the time. But referrals can also be made by schools, citizens. There are a variety of sources that can make a referral to DJS. So that number had sort of steadily declined until you can see in the pandemic, it just sort of cratered and has climbed since the pandemic, but is still lower than right before the COVID-19 pandemic. And I just want to point out that DJS has very little control over how many kids are being brought to them for an intake. The second long-term trend I wanted to discuss is something that DJS has some discretion over, which is how they, the intake, the decision they make at intake on what to do with a kid. And there's three things that they can choose to do. One is called resolve that case at intake. And essentially that would say the kid needs to go home and hopefully not show up again, but that's the end of the involvement in that circumstance with DJS. The second is what's called informal, or it's sometimes called pre-court supervision. And this would be where DJS would say, just an example, like for 6 months, we need to make sure that you don't reoffend. You need to attend school. And they might even say, there's a program that we'd like you to participate in. And if you do all those things, then at the end of 6 months, this will be resolved. But if you don't, we have the option of the third thing they can do at intake, which is formal a kid. And formal means refer it to the state's attorney's office for prosecution. And so these trends, the green line is the percentage of cases that's been formaled over time. And you can see 10 years ago, a majority of cases that came to DJS were formaled. And that began sort of a long decline. There's a little blip during COVID that I think I could explain if anyone was interested in me doing. And then it really declined, but has picked up since then in about the last 2 years. And I want to point out that I think that coincides with the current leadership of the Department of Juvenile Services. And then if you look at the blue line, which is the number of cases that are resolved at intake, that is almost the mirror image of the cases that are formal. And then I don't want to miss the orange line at the bottom, which is a smaller number of cases, but it used to be that close to 20% of cases were informal, so that pre-court supervision. Recently, that's only about 10% of cases. So the number of kids that are informal as a percentage has declined by about half. And then the last sort of long-term trend I want to show you is our adjudication decisions. And so not every kid who is formal is ultimately adjudicated. In fact, most of them aren't. And not every kid who is adjudicated is found delinquent. But of kids who are found delinquent, a judge can do one of two things with that kid. They can order them committed to a juvenile facility, or they can give them probation. And for the longest time, about 70% of those kids would get probation, and the other 30% would get committed. And there was a brief blip during COVID, which again, I could speculate on, and then another decline. And recently, about 80% of kids who are adjudicated delinquent get probation, and about 20% are committed. And that 80% is the highest we've seen, at least going back to 2010. And finally, the last thing I want to point out on this one is that these are not decisions made by DJS. These are decisions made by a juvenile judge or a juvenile magistrate. So Chapter 2 of our report looked at these community-based non-residential services. So these are kids who are DJS involved, and they're living, for the most part, at home with their family. And this is about 6,000 kids a year, not all at one time, but over the course of a year, maybe 6,000 kids who are DJS involved will be living in the community. And if they're getting services, many of them get services from what I call a contractual community-based provider. That's somebody that DJS has a contract with, and we pay them money to deliver a kind of service to that kid. And those services are generally mentoring or therapy. There's another kind of services that we might refer kids to as well, and those are non-contractual services. And this was sort of new to us as we started doing this work. I was under the assumption that like everybody we sent a kid to was somebody that we had a contractual relationship with. But it turns out that there's a number of providers that may have work with the jurisdiction where they are, like the county or the local school system, or they may just exist and have funding to take kids that DJS sends their way and give that kid some services. And so they're a part of this sort of ecosystem as well. And just pointing out that the community-based non-residential kids, about half of them that are in that are there because they're informal, and about half of them are there because they've been adjudicated and they're on probation. We want to look at intake decisions again. And the next couple slides are based on a sample of every kid who the most serious charge they were brought in for was a second-degree assault. And a second-degree assault is generally a fight where somebody, a fight without a weapon where somebody was hurt but not hurt badly. And that is, we use that because that is the most frequent charge that kids are brought to DJS for. And as you can see, the first time, kids that are brought in for this are most likely to be resolved at intake. But the percentage that are resolved at intake declines for every subsequent charge that a kid gets. So by the time they're in for a third or fourth or fifth charge, they're only about half the time resolved at intake. And as you can see, like if it's their first complaint, it's only formal 10% of the time, but if it's their third complaint, over a third of the time, those cases are formal. And those intake decisions vary widely by jurisdiction. So for example, in Charles County, a kid who's brought in for a second-degree assault, 90% of the time that case is going to be resolved at intake, or at least it was in the time that we looked at. Whereas in Montgomery County, it's only about 50%. And there are reasons for that, and I think one of those reasons is the availability of resources to refer a kid to, whether it's the ones that DJS has a contract with, or whether it's just other services in the community that are available. When DJS makes an intake decision, they have a tool, it's called the intake decision tool, the IDT. And we were interested in knowing how often did they follow that tool. In some cases, they have the discretion to not follow what the tool tells them to do. And what we found is, and we just looked at a sample of, I think, 75, so if we went bigger, we might see more. But only a little over half of the time did they follow the intake decision tool. So on the top line there, you can see 38 cases, the tool recommended that those cases be resolved in intake. They did that 32 of the 38 times. And the other 6 times, they treated that case a little bit more seriously and either informaled it or formaled it. And then you can see on that sort of third colored line, the tool recommended formaling a case and referring it to the state's attorney's office 16 times. And they did that 6 of those times. 7 of those were resolved at intake and 3 of those were informal. DJS uses a case management system called Assist, and I can talk more about that later. But we went through those placement records for a sample of those second-degree assault cases. And we could only find evidence that a kid had been referred to a contractual community-based provider in 30% of those cases. So some of these kids may have been getting some of those non-contractual referrals, but DJS has limited control over, or oversight over those non-contractual placements. So, you know, a majority of kids did not, at least according to their case management system, get a referral to one of these programs that offers mentoring or therapy or things like that.
You said did not.
Correct, 70% did not. And last one on community-based services. There's also a range in how long it takes a kid between when they have an intake at DJS and an intake with this community-based service provider. But generally, you're talking about 30 to 40 days. And a lot of providers and people in the field would say, that's too long. And they would say, for a kid, especially a younger kid, being arrested maybe for the first time, being brought home by the police or brought to DJS by the police, maybe even having handcuffs put on you, like that's a significant event in a young kid's life. And in many cases, maybe enough for a kid to decide, like, I want to not do this anymore and I want to go down a better path. And that would be the best time to get that kid connected with a place that could help them. But in many cases, it's 30 days, 40 days, 60 days between when the kid is able to get connected with the place that can help them. And I think it speaks a little bit to the availability of services. Our third chapter was on DJS's oversight of these community service providers, and this is just one slide on this, and I'm going to quickly go through what we found. Most of their oversight is on fiscal compliance, and so they're making sure that when invoices are submitted, they are as accurate as they can be, they contain the correct information, and they're meeting the terms and conditions of their contract, and then they would make payment. They do collect limited information on what I would call performance, so how many kids completed the program successfully? What was the amount of time between when a kid was referred and when an intake occurred? But it doesn't seem like that information is validated in the sense that DJS ensures that it's accurate, or that they use that information to assess the quality or performance of that contractual provider. We also learned that options for kids can be limited by scarcity. There's rural areas of the state that don't have the same providers available as some of the other areas of the state. And there's the top tier of services for kids called evidence-based services, or EBS. And there's no provider available to serve the kids in Baltimore City that is one of these EBS providers. The final thing on the oversight of the contractual providers is they are essentially our, if someone is working on DJS's behalf with a kid in the community, they are most likely not a DJS employee, they are a contractual employee, not of DJS, but of some company business that's providing this. And DJS has limited visibility into any staffing issues that may happen at these places. And contractor turnover can be an issue. These are, in some cases, hard jobs to fill and hard jobs to keep people in. And it's difficult for DJS to know in somewhat near real time if providers have the amount of staff necessary to deliver the services that we're asking them to deliver. Our fourth chapter was on children in need of services or SINs. And we wanted to understand how that was being used. And I know this shows referrals by county, but let me back up and talk about what SINs is. They are children who are exhibiting troubling behaviors that may not be technically delinquent. And we're talking about 1.5%, or in 2023, 2% of the referrals to DJS are SINs referrals. There's four main categories for SINs kids: truant kids, ungovernable kids, kids that are a danger to themselves or others, or runaways or other status offenses. And status offenses are offenses that can only be committed by a kid. Like, I'm 50 years old, I can't run away. A kid can run away. Changes to the law over the last couple of years probably affected the number of SINs referrals. For example, kids of a certain age couldn't be charged with certain crimes, but they could be charged with, say, being ungovernable or being dangerous to themselves or others. As shown in here, and I don't want to read into this too closely, but SINs is used differently in different jurisdictions. I know DJS has spent time educating the local jurisdictions in the state on how this can and should be used. The data about this is not great. There were jurisdictions that years ago might have accepted SINs referrals, but they didn't enter them into ASSIST, the case management database. Or there are some jurisdictions that have sort of diversion programs. They may have their own truancy program. And so instead of a kid showing up at DJS, they would just go directly to this truancy program, and there wouldn't be a record of that offense. SINS referrals did increase between 2022 and 2023, and you can see most of that increase is the blue part of that line, which is referrals for a kid being ungovernable. And most of that increase was also due to kids that were aged 10 to 12, and actually a few kids that were under the age of 12, which went from like dozens maybe in 2022 to near 200 in 2023. It was interesting, when we looked at the disposition of SINS referrals, over 4 out of 5 of SINS referrals are resolved in intake. And I'll talk some more about that on the next slide. This was of a sample, and I think 0.3%, which represented 3 cases in the sample, were actually formaled. And the report talks in a little bit of detail about those particular cases. And the other 18% are informal. Sorry. And as we dug into the case notes on these kids who were SINS referrals that were resolved at intake, one of the things we found is that in at least a quarter of the cases, those were resolved without an intake meeting ever having occurred because the kid and their family didn't show up for the meeting. Now, DJS can make an informed decision to resolve a case at intake even if they don't actually meet with the family in person, but we thought that this was interesting and worth sharing. The last chapter of our report was case histories of a little more than a dozen kids, and let me talk about this. So a little less than a year ago, the Attorney General announced the indictment of a number of young people for a series of armed robberies and armed carjackings, amongst other offenses, that had over 80 victims. And I was curious if DJS had had any history, previous history of interaction with these kids. And sorry, a couple of them were 18 or 19 years old, but the rest of them were juveniles at the time of the indictment. And so I asked DJS for the case histories for what ultimately was 15 kids. And as best I could in Chapter 5 of that report, I sort of transcribed their case histories anonymously from the ASSIST database. I can't validate the accuracy of that. If something doesn't get entered in there, I can't see it. And then we wanted to sort of summarize what we found about these 15 kids. The first is that 14 of them had had a history of involvement with DJS before this indictment had come down. And of those kids, the average age at first contact was 13. One was as young as 10 or 11. This is an example of ASSIST being imperfect. It's not clear if the kid was 10 or 11. One first intake when they were as old as 16. Let me back up a sec. These kids are alleged to have committed these offenses. I haven't the slightest idea if the adults have been found guilty, if the kids have been adjudicated delinquent. These are alleged offenses. I also want to point out that this is obviously not a random sample. Like, I purposefully wanted to do analysis of 15 kids who were involved or allegedly involved in these incidents. Over 2/3 of the referrals to DJS had been formaled and sent to the state's attorney's office. Of 45 of those referrals, 31 were formaled, 4 were informal, and 10 were resolved in intake. We talked about the IDT, the intake decision tool, earlier. DJS was more likely to sort of upgrade the disposition of an intake based on what the tool said than they were to downgrade it. So we found 16 times where, for example, the IDT might have said resolve at intake, and they decided to formal something instead. And we found only 2 times where the IDT might have said informal it, and DJS decided to resolve it at intake. And then finally, 5 of these 15 kids had previously been referred to these contractual community-based services. They're much more likely to get electronic monitoring, community detention, or the evening reporting center, which is this DJS-operated bus that picks kids up after school and takes them to a place where they get some extra help. Some may have been referred to these non-contractual providers that we mentioned earlier. I want to briefly go through some recommendations that were in the report. One is that ASSIST should be enhanced. I know they had been working on it years ago. I think abandoned that and may be picking that up again. but that is a piece of software that is essentially an electronic copy of a paper filing system. And it is not older than me, but I think it dates back to the 90s. They should share and replicate best practices. We talk to a lot of stakeholders, not just DJS employees, but people that are sort of working in different parts of this field. And a lot of them had really good things to say about some particular things that DJS is doing. Some of the staff went down to a juvenile services fair in Prince George's County that involved contractual providers, non-contractual providers, DJS employees, other stakeholders. It was really well received, and something like that should be replicated in other parts of the state and shouldn't just be in one or two places. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but they should collect the data that lets them evaluate the performance of their contractual providers. I don't think I need to say much more than that. And they should also have some visibility into the staffing levels of their providers, which again are really the only people that are in the community working with these 6,000 kids a year. They should do their best to ensure that there are sufficient providers throughout the state. And I would, and last recommendation is, and see what they can do to make sure that there are evidence-based service providers available to Baltimore City kids as well as the kids they already serve. And like, this isn't explicit in the report, but when we looked at those kids in community services, the question we really wanted to know is, if you had two equal groups of kids, they all had the same histories, they're two twin groups, basically. And one of those groups got community-based services, mentoring, therapy, and the other group didn't. Was the first group any better off? And my staff's really good at this sort of analysis, and we did the best we could. And ultimately, we didn't come up with the answer to that question that we felt confident that we could publish. But DJS has some talented research and analytical staff, and I think they should try and answer that question. And then I think they should know if their providers are delivering for us what we have asked them to deliver, not just meeting the terms and conditions of their contract, but are they making a difference in the lives of the kids that we're referring to them. We weren't able to answer those questions, but I think long-term that's something that would be of interest to the state. With that, let me conclude, again, say thank you for your time, and that I'm happy to answer any questions.
Director Powell, thank you very much for your presentation, very informative. Questions from the committee. We'll start off with Senator McKay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your report. My question has to do with drilling down into the interviewing with staff and that kind of stuff. Did you feel that they were free to answer, or did you feel that there was some form of resistance to answers?
I felt they were very transparent. They were transparent in sharing data with us, which they have to do anyway, but like some agencies like to make that a bit of a process. Very transparent with that. And also candid in their conversations, I think, an awareness that they've made improvements in some areas, that there are more improvements to be made. Many of those folks are career DJS employees. This is something that they've been doing for a long time and obviously care about, and that's evident in the conversations we've had with them.
If I may, with a follow-up. Thank you, sir. Speaking along those lines of career employees, and we're very appreciative, and this will be a question for the secretary later, but I'm very concerned about our employees and workplace violence, a variety of different things. Did you see anything that was alarming? Obviously, we go from one administration to a different administration, and we're willing to try something new and put in a different direction, but there has to be accountability. Did you get any kind of sense from any of the employees that said, maybe this isn't what we should be doing, we should look back to past practices? Anything that you can share?
I'm happy to share, and I would say no. I did not hear somebody that expressed that they felt like things were going in the wrong direction or things might have been better before. My sense, and in conversations with my staff that had a lot of these meetings, that this was a forward-looking bunch.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, and good morning. First of all, thank you for this. And all the time I've been in the General Assembly, I don't think I've ever had a presentation from your office, so this is helpful. Couple questions. On, I think it was your second slide, you had talked about things being resolved at intake, there being an uptick in formal referrals. If I'm understanding that correctly, that means in the time when there's been much conversation about juvenile crime, DJS has actually come down and sent many of these cases, or referred them to the state's attorneys for to be adjudicated. So
Correct. So in the last 2 years, they are more likely to formal a case and less likely to resolve them at intake.
Okay. The non-contractual placements, as I was listening, it's somewhat fascinating for me. How number one, how does DJS, can you explain again how DJS engages these non-contractual placements?
This is part of the problem. I mean, it's a good question, right? There may be a program in the community. DJS doesn't have a contractual relationship with it, but they work on the local level, and they know, like, they have some confidence that this program might be helpful for a kid. And so they can sort of, I don't want to mix terms, but sort of informally refer a kid to a program that, again, DJS doesn't have a contractual relationship with, but an employee feels like might be of benefit to that child. But because there's no relationship, there's a lack of oversight over what's happening in that program. There's a lack of accountability for that program, for what they're delivering. It's not clear if information is shared in the way that it would be with a provider that you had a contract with.
How does the vendor even get paid if there's no contract? Is it under a certain dollar amount? Or?
Again, no, I think, and they might know this better than I do, but it could be a program that a county sponsors. It could be a program that gets money from a grant. I'm just guessing here. They might know for sure what those things are. In Chapter 2 of the report, we talk about that Prince George's County sort of conference and list the providers that were there. And so you can see who they are, if they're contractual, non-contractual, or other, and understand the kind of services that they offer.
Gotcha. And the last question, from your evaluation, what do you believe DGS was doing well?
What do I believe they're doing well? No, look, I mean, the nature of this job sometimes is that we come in there looking to
You look for problems, you don't necessarily look for.
And the other thing is, I don't want to be subjective about, like, is more cases being formaled good, bad? I don't know. I just know that more cases are being informaled.
But that finding does speak to this perception and that's been talked about in the media, that no one's holding these children accountable. I'm
more comfortable, Senator, saying what surprised me, and one of the things that surprised me was in those case histories, how much more often they took a referral more seriously rather than less seriously. And seriously is not a precise term, but the tool might have said, based on our research, like, the right thing to do for this kid is to take them home, and instead they decided to
be formal.
Have informal or formal that referral. So
thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Powell, this is, first of all, I should note Mr. Powell's my constituent. It's nice to have you down
Happily.
here.
Thank you.
And the report was very comprehensive and very interesting. On the other hand, the report seemed to be mostly about process. In fact, at one point, I read it lengthily last night. I prepared a flow chart. It was almost like pots. So many cases went into this pot, and so many cases went into that pot, and pot A had 4 outlets, and somebody went into box A, and somebody went to box B. So it's a pretty good chart of how these cases flow through the system and how many go here and how many go there. But we're talking about people. This really didn't.
Children.
Until we get down to the case studies, it really was rather antiseptic. It didn't seem like you were dealing with people. It's more like, how does the process work? How is it all set up? So I've got a couple of questions about that, and then I want to talk about the people. So firstly, on the process, you indicated that mostly what DJS seems to do is monitor the fiscal, whether or not these various providers of services are complying with their fiscal obligations.
Correct.
But there was no attempt on the part of DJS apparently to figure out whether these providers are being effective at doing what they're doing. And you, in your role, were not able to assess the effectiveness of one provider as opposed to another. So all we know is that human beings are assigned to this particular provider and that fiscally the provider is doing what it's supposed to do. That's all we can tell based on your report.
Generally, one I would say, even if we could, I'd be reluctant to sort of compare provider to provider because they're not apples to apples. Like they do slightly different things. They serve slightly different populations.
But wouldn't you agree that someone should do that? Someone should assess whether when someone exits a program, the program has been successful as opposed to the program has been unsuccessful.
Yeah, look, like I said, I think the two things that moving forward someone should try and figure out is, are kids who are being provided services in the community, are they better off than if they hadn't been provided those services?
Right.
And are those providers that are working with them effective on an individual basis?
And at the end of your presentation, basically what you told us is you were unable to make that assessment.
We were unable to do, yes.
So, but then you get to the individual case histories. And so now we're migrating from an analysis of process to an analysis of human beings. And I found this to be fascinating because, and you indicated the case histories are perhaps not typical case histories.
I would hope not.
They're isolated, and these were people the Attorney General arrested for a particular reason. But when we look into their past, we see, at least what I saw was in case after case, these people were, I think the word was referred, again and again and again and again. Now, let me start by eschewing partisanship here because almost all of these dates occurred prior to the current administration taking over. As I went through it, there were very few dates that post-dated the inauguration in 2023 of the current governor.
Yeah, and I think the indictment came out just over a year after the current administration took over. So yes, every prior to that year would have all been.
So partisanship isn't involved here. But what I was appalled about was that the same individuals went into the system and then came back out, and then went in again and came back out, and went in again and came back out. I presume that along the way there were services being provided in some of these cases to some of these individuals. Obviously, they didn't succeed because the individual, at the end of the day, came back into the system again. So there's, I guess the one word that was completely absent from the report was the word recidivism. I could find no information in the report about recidivism, and I would think that evaluating whether or not this agency is being successful, that would be the word that would be the first word out of my mouth as to whether it's dealing with young people in such a way that they don't recidivate.
So we wanted to, in Chapter 2, do that quantitative analysis of recidivism rates for kids who were similar and got community services compared to kids, similar kids who did not get them. And that's what we were ultimately unable to do. And it's part of the reason I included those case histories in Chapter 5, because I really wanted to understand. And to be clear, like, when I got those names, I knew they had been indicted for the crimes they had been indicted before, but I had no idea what those case histories would be. And I wrote them basically as I read them. DJS already publishes a recidivism rate for different groups of youth, overall youth. We didn't need to redo what DJS's analysis, but I did really want to understand, is recidivism less for kids who are helped or for kids who aren't helped? And like I said, ultimately, we weren't able to come up to an answer that I was confident enough in to publish.
Okay. Well, once again, thank you very much for the work you did. This is fascinating information. It was, I will say last night, fascinating reading. And when the secretary comes up, I'm sure we'll have some questions to direct to him. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I came in a little late, but the quality of your report and your presentation were excellent. It's really, usually when you're fourth or fifth in questioning, other people have covered to some extent some things you're curious about. But I started in Annapolis in 1998 on the Appropriations Committee. And from that moment till now, it's not good news, I hear this same issue, which is we have lots and lots of government departments and they have lots of data and they explain what the intake, the process, and there is never, concrete data or concrete goals about outcomes for which we can measure whether they're being held accountable. So in some sense, no criticism to you, your report, as Senator West was kind of indicating, has almost an audit sound to it, not so much a government accountability, which to me is about outcome. So my question for you sort of is that, it's a long-winded question, is that sort of how you felt when you were going through the process, that you were most hampered, not with so much the data, which you could look at, but whether or not either DJS or the DGS and the providers, or DGS looking at the providers, could speak to whether they have measurable success, including what is the measure of success?
I think if I had, in my personal life, if I had 5 different contractors that were doing essentially the same thing, or for me, I would want to know which of them performed the best. And if one of them was struggling, like why, so I could either repair that or move on. Look, there's nothing in there to suggest that they're not great. It's just difficult to know when you don't have the information to make that evaluation.
Given your expertise, I guess the other thing I'd like to know is, I had a question about, your contracting with the providers, sort of on the same theme, which is, in your professional opinion, is it impossible to put into a contract with the provider or to impose on DJS concrete criteria for success so that every time you or others come in to assess them, you have these benchmarks of outcomes? I mean, is that something that someone would respond to me and say, look, the nature of this work is so elusive and complicated, we'll never be able to do it? Or is it like, hey, we just culturally don't do this, but we really should start doing this?
No, I think it's a thing that they could and maybe should do, and not so that I can evaluate them better, but so that they can look at their providers and make decisions about what's working and what's not.
Well, to help us too.
And that's more of an art than a science, maybe. Like, you don't want to say, well, look, if you don't have a 90% completion rate, then we're not going to renew your contract. But maybe that's the start of a conversation about what do we need to do in order to help you meet the objectives that we have for you.
And Senator West brought this up, and I don't want to use this only as the criteria, but I would think recidivism, how many times an individual youth goes in and out of this system, is probably the number one data point that I would measure success by.
Senator, maybe I can just share something with the committee that didn't make it into the report, but we finish these things and then I think of all the questions that I didn't think of before.
Oh.
And we're talking about kids, you read the case histories that are come back 5 times, 10 times. And we looked at kids who came in for the first time in 2019 and they were 15 years old. So all of them are adults by now.
Right.
So they can no longer collect any more juvenile charges. And we sort of broke that down by how many of them that came in for the first time never came in again. And you can all guess in your minds. It's 60%. So 60% of kids who come in for the first time don't ever come back. And 20% come back once, but not one more time, but not 2 more times. So it's only 20% of kids, and DJS probably has better numbers. I'm doing back of the envelope stuff, but it's 20% of the kids who come in for the first time come in 3 or more times ultimately. So I just share that with you because it helps, I think, have some perspective about their caseload.
And then just to drill down, if you don't mind, just a couple more technical questions. You mentioned, again, I came in a little late, that you saw that oftentimes, or DJS has a tool, but they would override or ignore the suggestion. So is that a best practice? In other words, I kind of don't know if you have a tool and then you override it in a quite routine way, can you speak to that issue?
It's a valid question. I think there's two, so it's complicated. One is, I think the tool may recommend something, but in some cases, by law, they have to do something. And so like, the tool might say informal it, but the law says you need to formal it. And so that would be one reason to override the tool.
Right.
There's also like just weird circumstance where like a kid may already be DJS involved for something serious. They're going through the juvenile court process and they pick up a charge for shoplifting or something like that. They may resolve, even if the tool says formal this, like they're already formal. They're already, going through the legal process, and so they will resolve that relatively minor charge.
So, not to, a little bit to interrupt, because I get what you're saying. I just want to make sure, maybe they should have made it into the report in a footnote, but just when I hear that a tool's there and it's being overridden or ignored, that I wonder about that. So I'm wondering if in the future, and I don't know if you can speak to it now even, but if your review showed that in most of these cases, while the tool was not followed, there were reasons for it, and that's best practices. I think I just want to have that footnote in the report.
I think there's a list of some of those reasons, and it's going to be in chapter 2 on why they make a decision that deviates from the tool. But the tool is a tool, and it's probably imperfect in itself. And I think, they should have that latitude to be able to deviate from it. But the fact that they deviated from it 48% of the time caught my attention, and it's the reason we included it in the report.
And just one last one, since we're talking about I think there's a need to have measurable outcomes regarding the children with, recidivism could be there could be other words and several others.
Yeah.
It's the gold standard. Did you get a chance, or will you in the future be able to assess our DJS with other states and best practices? Or is that in the report and you just didn't get to that?
No.
Again, other states that might be using more outcome versus process data.
I mean, I think certainly Maryland and probably most states publish a juvenile recidivism rate. And sometimes it's complicated because they're calculated differently. Like some of it might be a 1-year rate, a 3-year rate. There's, do they have adult information? I mean, we did that work. We got from the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services adult offenses committed by kids who were juveniles a few years ago, and so they're in our database, but we wanted to have that visibility. Again, we were very thorough in trying to do that analysis, and just based on the data available, we weren't able to do it.
I'm sorry, one last thing. Evidence-based services,
Yeah.
My layman reaction to that is there should be no provider in the state who doesn't work off of evidence-based services. So could you just explain that term to me?
Sure, evidence-based services, and I'm not the greatest at this, and they might be better at it, but it's something that sort of like academically, scientifically has been shown that like when delivered with fidelity, it has a statistically significant
Sort of about the
result.
sort of relates to outcome.
Yeah,
So if you have evidence-based services, you probably have more achievable outcomes.
That's right. And I would just push back carefully on the idea that non-evidence-based service providers aren't of any value. They might be. The problem is we just don't know. And I think we should know.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this very in-depth report. I just have a couple questions because I want to echo that when I'm looking through even your case histories, many are before the Juvenile Justice, Accountability Act or whatever it is called this time, but when they changed the laws on what could actually be an incarcerable or a chargeable offense. So many people, these numbers are indicative post that legislation to show that conveniently that there may have been a slowing in the charges, but not necessarily the interactions with law enforcement. Is that accurate? Because of the changes in the laws and the types of things that law enforcement can then arrest, there's going to be a change in the the graphic you gave,
Yeah.
it's going to change. It's going to appear more favorable because there's less intakes, because there's less things that officers can actually charge juveniles with.
Of course, like if you can't charge a juvenile with a certain offense and you choose to not make a SINS referral, then
Correct.
yes, you would have fewer referrals.
Yes, and then on the SINS referrals, when we have the SINS referrals or we have the intake and, you know, they give the adjudication, they just, you know, release back to the parents, they don't formalize or what, it's handled at intake.
4 out of 5 times, yeah.
It's handled at intake. Are those records then, when they're actually charged later, because some of these juveniles, I see motor vehicle theft at 11, motor vehicle theft, rape, carjacking. Before they're actually, when they're released at intake or they're handled at intake, are those files released to the court when they're actually then charged with a crime?
I don't know the answer to that question. I would say for those 15 kids, I don't believe any of them had a SINS referral in those histories. I can go through it again, but
Okay.
I think they were all for like non-status offenses. You know, it's like the most minor one was like 4th-degree burglary, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, okay.
Obviously, the most serious ones are.
Well, I'm just pointing out that we're also trying to get an accurate history of the criminal behavior of the intake of the person that's being intaken, right? Being arrested or being formalized or whatever you're calling them. So that would be something that would come into play with this. Also, you brought up the assist program. Did you ever mention, or did anybody in your interviews mention that they had spent years and a lot of money on a different program
Yeah.
that was going to be current and updated and be better than the program that we're using now? And when this administration came in, this administration decided to get rid of CJAMs and go back to assist.
I was made aware of that, yeah.
Why? I'm just curious, you didn't bring that up in your report. Because you mentioned it, that it's not as old as you,
Right.
but it's an antiquated program. So you made a point to say that there potentially is an opportunity to improve there, the way I took it.
It's fair, yeah.
But there was a program that was in place prior to the secretary coming in where they had spent years and a lot of money to get it updated and a lot of hours in training persons.
Yeah.
And then they scrapped it and went back to the assist program. I would say that that's a little bit of mismanagement in and of itself, because we've invested a lot in this, training, money, hours, and then to just come in without actually getting a good, accurate picture of it, we scrap it and go back to an antiquated program.
Yeah, all I know is that it was scrapped. I know they had spent a long time. They had high hopes for it. IT projects get scrapped for a variety of reasons. I don't have any idea why this one in particular was or what the plan forward for that is.
Did you happen to speak with any of the staff at the facilities when you went?
We went to intake facilities and spoke with staff there, yeah.
You spoke with staff or you spoke with supervisors? I don't think you spoke with any staff.
Both.
You did? Do you have a list of those people you spoke with? Because the reason I'm asking is I'm being told that no staff that were on the ground level that deal with juveniles were spoken to.
Let me go through our notes and see what I can get you.
I'm being told you spoke with supervisors at facilities. I'm not being told that you spoke with any staff who are the ones that are being bit, spit on, and assaulted
In juvenile
in the
facilities,
intake facilities.
we were looking at community service. We didn't go to facilities.
Oh, you
We
didn't?
We went to intake. We met with supervisors and staff at intake.
Okay, but isn't that an extension of this that we have, like, secretary, or they're putting these in juvenile facilities? I don't understand why that wouldn't have been something to consider.
I think back on slide 2, like we had 6 months to do this work, and we
understand that.
chose to look at 4 things. The ones that were asked of us to look
Yeah.
at were the kids that are in the community, and so
Understood,
Maybe next
understood.
year, maybe
But
this
I think this is what my good friend from Western Maryland was also alluding to, is that there's been an increase in assaults on staff that wasn't documented in this, and it's not reflected anywhere. There's been multiple, I don't want to call them riots, but uprisings that local law enforcement had to respond in to quell. And at the same time, on these facilities, which obviously you didn't go into, but they've made it known that they don't have, they don't monitor phone calls of the kids anymore. They're turning off video systems in the facilities. This just seems very odd. Your report is very 6 months. You went down at these different, and it's very regimented, but it didn't go outside the scope of the health of the department, the health of those that are serving this department. The recidivism would have been something. I mean, there's just so many points to this, and I understand you had 6 months, but the constant theme that I'm hearing from the people that are boots on the ground is assaults are up. There's
In facilities.
in facilities. The staffing is down, and we're not doing, and the secretary is not doing his job or due diligence to prepare them to get more staff, to be safe, and to hold those juveniles accountable. As a matter of fact, the secretary would love to release more of them by his own statements. So that's a different thing. I'll talk to him about that.
No,
But
Senator, and that's certainly something we could look at moving forward. We were, like, again, based on our conversations with stakeholders, community services, oversight of community service providers, and SINS kids were what we were asked to do. And then I sort of added those indicted kids because it just came to my attention. I thought,
Yeah, but those indicted kids, aren't they going to go to the facilities I'm talking about? Or they should, but some of them aren't. I've seen some of them are being released the next day back to
that
their
was all,
parents.
that was all prior to the indictment. And like, that data is what that data is. And I thought you would find it interesting.
I definitely do. I appreciate the report. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we switch over to the vice chair, I want to make sure, so, I mean, we, as you remember, Senator, we passed the correctional ombudsman bill. We established that last year, and the juvenile justice monitoring unit has now been slid under there. We should bring them in and ask them for an assessment, because that'll speak a lot to what you're talking about. This report really focused more on overall process, not what's happening kind of behind the walls. So I think the line of inquiry is appropriate generally, but I know this report didn't touch on that, so we'll definitely be in touch with the correctional ombudsman and the juvenile justice monitoring unit on that. So a lot of discordant kind of threads through the questions. I want to make sure we bring it together. And I have a couple questions for you before I switch it over to the vice chair, because, look, obviously, you know, we talked about the juvenile crime trends trending generally in the right direction, but they're not in a level that is sustainable or acceptable. I don't think anyone accepts that here. Also, you know, we have disparities, racial disparities in our criminal justice system that are very prevalent, not only in the juvenile justice system, but then also in the adult system. You have 90% of folks that are in the juvenile system that are people of color, the majority of whom are African American. And then when you get to the adult system, that compounds, that trend continues, and you get to a 70% African American percentage of our prison population being black in a state where 32 or 30% of the population is black. I don't think any of these, like, and the status quo is not acceptable on either end, on the crime side or on the incarceration side. That's why the information in this report is actually very important, because for reform-minded people that want to push reforms and put us on a pathway to correct some of these injustices, we got to get the process right through juvenile justice. Like, we've got this department has got to work. And I think some of the information in this report is very troubling. And I think you can only fix this stuff if you address it head on and have an honest conversation. And so now we're going to have we're going to have more of a conversation with the secretary. But for you, I want to make sure we highlight some of the good and critical information that you have brought forth in this report in just a clean, crisp way. And I want to talk first about the wait times for services. And just, can you please highlight, I think you said it was like 30 to 60 day. I mean, can you just highlight about, so when someone has that interaction with law enforcement, it's taking them, in some cases, 90 days to get any form of service. That status quo is unacceptable. Can you just highlight that again? Because I'm going to walk through a couple of the highlights of the report, starting with intake and the delay for services.
Do you want me to pull that slide up?
Yes, please.
Sorry, where is it? Here you go.
All right. So just, again, highlight again the percentages of, so from first interaction to when that youth gets some sort of contact for services.
If they get one.
If they get it. If you could highlight that.
Sure. It's the dots in the middle of each of those jurisdictions is the average, and those sort of error bars show the 25th and 75th percentile. So there's actually kids outside of those ranges, but on either side. And again, Baltimore City is the one that's quickest to place kids. And again, conversations that we have had have suggested that the quicker you get a kid into one of those programs, the more effective that program is, because a lot of times, just by being arrested, it has the potential to be transformational in a kid's life.
It's interesting because, so obviously there's a connection between resources and time for connection. So the more rural areas have some less resources and unable to connect more quickly. And then Montgomery County, for instance, has a more, like a quicker turnaround time for that. It's interesting because, Baltimore City, you said was one of the fastest, but, even in the final, I think I read this, and Mark, you may be able to correct this with me, but, Baltimore City is 9% of the population of the state, but 40% of the overall prison population. And then on the rural areas, they're 1% of the state's population, but 10% of the prison population. I mean, this stuff trickles up, obviously. So, I mean, it's important to understand what those numbers look like and the connection to services, because we're going to get to this in the case history, because this stuff, the repeat, and then graduate to adult system, if we get this right here in the juvenile system, we're going to save ourselves a lot of pain.
If I might, one of the conversations I had with somebody who works in county government and cares deeply about this stuff is like, if a kid's committing vehicle theft at 15, 16, and 17, like there's no reason to think that that kid's not going to be committing it at 18, but with very different consequences, both for that kid and for the county or the state. And so to them, that is like the urgency of dealing with these kids when that opportunity exists.
And it's not happening. So then second, for the tracking of the services, the community-based services, we can go back to that slide as well. I thought that was one of the more troubling, and Senator James and Senator West have alluded to this. I thought it was one of the more troubling aspects of the report, not the report, but the actual findings. Can you talk to us more about, so obviously they can track, the fiscal piece, how much you're spending, and maybe completion rates, but that completion is not necessarily success. Can you just highlight that again? I found it very troubling that we're unable to track if the youths that are involved in, I think 70% encompasses 70%, these contractual-based services, the majority of these interactions we're not tracking them. There's no metric for success in terms of recidivism or actual helping of the youth. And can you tease that out? Can you explain that to the community?
Well, and if you don't mind, so it's actually, of the informal kids, it's only 30% of them that we see had been referred to a contractual community-based service. So 70% of them, it doesn't look like they were. So it's just 30% of those kids. And yes, they have a limited ability based on data that they get to be able to tell, is that provider effective? They know if the provider's, well, they sort of know if the provider's doing what the contract asks them to do, but they don't know the outcomes. And if that is of benefit to the kid, and they certainly, I don't think, know, is one provider better at getting outcomes than another? And I think that's something that would be important for them to know.
That goes then to, so an inability to track metrics for success is a significant problem. But
and again,
my word's not yours. I mean,
and again, it's not easy, right?
Yeah, no.
But yeah.
Then there's a case management system, and we talked. Senator Fulton talked a little bit about the legacy systems. But what does that case management system look like? The assist system. How does that function? Why are we in 2025 and still unable to track? Or why is no one thinking, oh, maybe we should track these metrics for success? Maybe we should put in place a system to do that. You can't answer those questions as secretary yet, but just talk to us about the limitations of the current system.
Right. It's not enough for me to just say it's an old system, right? Yeah. But let me give an example. And I think I said earlier, it's like basically a digital version of a piece of paper. So like some of the reason we did samples in there is because the information is just sort of like in a narrative box. And I can't do that for 15,000 kids a year. So the idea that you would like query, well, let's find every kid who's been referred to the evening reporting center, like you can't do that, I don't think. But if not evening reporting center, there's other things where that's just very difficult to do. It's not a tool where you can sort of query simple questions and get simple answers. And as to why they decided to move away from it, and then why they decided to abandon that and what they plan on doing moving forward, I don't know.
so we talk a lot about data-driven decision-making, and it's, I think, frustrating for us not to have that information or not to be able to disaggregate data sets to make better informed decisions, to get better outcomes. And so the reason why I'm just kind of honing in on this, because these processes matter for the policies that we're able to adopt. And if you're a reform-minded person, you just want to be able to have this information to make good decisions moving forward to correct those injustices on both sides of the spectrum that I'm talking about. And so it's just very frustrating that we're not able to have that data to make good information, which is why I bring this up. Prince George's County. There was a note in there about Prince George's County, how they did a particularly good job with service delivery and data tracking. Can you just talk a little bit more about that? Because maybe that could be a model for success. I don't know.
I'm not sure if they did a great job with delivery or tracking, but I do know that they've got sort of this, that they convened this group with DJS, with contractual providers, with non-contractual providers. They're all listed who participated in that. Some of my staff were there, thought it was a great event. The other participants thought it was a great event. And it allows them on a local level to sort of coordinate what they're doing, know who to call about something. And that seemed, I'm not sure unique to Prince George's County, but sort of initiated there, and something like that might be of benefit if it happened in other places where it may not be currently.
It might be good for the members to check that out, read that piece of the report. I thought it was pretty informative. We talked about the case history, so I'll stop there and shift over to other members, but Senator Wallstrecker, did you have questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm hesitant to go after the chairman. I usually try to get my questions in first because that was, I think, an important summary of some of the issues we're dealing with, and for those, as the chairman said, who are reform-minded, the issues of racial justice are top of mind. I did step out for a hearing in another committee, so if these questions were asked, please let me know, and I won't repeat them. This is my 19th legislative session here, and I've never seen a report as comprehensive and thoughtful as the one you produced, so thank you. And you're being able to do so with political neutrality is incredibly valued, so thank you for that. I had a couple questions related to your presentation and how we interpret some of the statistics and your discussions with the agency. So one of the first graphics you showed is that complaints are down, and I think that's a good thing and resulting from good policies, some that we've passed and some culture changes in our schools and community. But I just want to be clear, from a statistical point of view, that doesn't indicate that the behaviors that were underlying the higher levels of complaints have ceased, only that the number of complaints have gone down.
Senator, I had a note on my slide that I didn't share, which is that, yes, this is not, I wouldn't say that this is juvenile crime. These are referrals to the Department of Juvenile Services, and they can happen for a variety of reasons, and they can go up and, I mean, crimes are committed where a referral is not made, like, because police don't identify who might have done that thing, both for adults and for children. So this is not juvenile crime. This is referrals to DJS, which can include a 10-year-old truant kid.
Right, but on the opposite end, just to use your example, where previously a school may refer a 10-year-old truant kid, that 10-year-old could still be truant under current statistics, but not referred. Or there could be a schoolyard fight that may have been referred as a second-degree assault, but that is handled as a disciplinary matter within the school. Or finding marijuana in a locker or something like that, that once culturally was referred to DJS, that is still occurring at the same rate. In other words, the crime itself isn't down. But culturally, we've changed how we treat those things, and they're no longer being referred.
It could be, and in fact, some of my staff, and let me just acknowledge them and the work that they did. I appreciate the nice things you said about the report. It is 99% them, if not 100%. But there's a whole variety of reasons that the number of referrals can go up or down. Some of it is statute, some of it's regulatory, some of it's policy, some of it's decisions made at a local police level, some of it is diversion, some of it is resources available to divert kids to. And, you know, and as I've mentioned before, like, this data is also affected, not in a large way, by like the fact that one jurisdiction until a few years ago just never entered SINS cases in assist. They would do the intake, but it wouldn't end up in the database, and so that wouldn't show up as a referral. There are many, many factors, but I think you can see, and look, the orange line is smoothed out, and if you can see those little bars behind it, those are the actual numbers per month. But like, there was a trend, and there are probably reasons behind that trend, and I don't think it surprises anybody that referrals declined precipitously during a pandemic, and that they have risen slowly since then, not because there's more juveniles committing more crimes, but just because the system is sort of recovering from an event that hadn't happened in 100 years.
Great. You showed a slide that showed that as a juvenile approaches intake for their second, third, fourth, fifth touch with the system, the number of formals increases, and that makes sense intuitively.
Yeah.
What doesn't make sense to me is the proportion, and I wanted to understand what your discussions were with the department. If 66% of third touches are informal, to me that is surprising. In other words, is that accurate? You're looking at me as if I stated an inaccurate number. So
Let me try and state it as best I can. And
yeah,
so if a kid comes in for a second-degree assault, and it is their third time they have had an intake with DJS for any reason, or third or more, then 54% of the time that is resolved at intake, 11% of the time it's informal, and 35% of the time it's referred to the state's attorney's office.
okay, thank you. I'm not wearing my glasses here. So
I'm lost without mine.
on the third offense, the third referral,
Yeah.
a majority of children are still being resolved at intake. And
Correct.
so, in other words, as a policymaker, it makes sense to me that the number of things that are informal or formal, as opposed to resolved at intake, is increasing as a child continues to offend. What is surprising to me is that a majority are still resolved at intake at third offense. To me, just thinking about how this might happen in the real world, this is a child who is continuing to engage in dangerous behavior, and after multiple touches with the system is not rehabilitating in a way. And so the fact that they are being resolved at intake at third offense, a majority of children, strikes me as surprising. I'm not looking for you to make a values judgment. I can ask the secretary and as policymakers. I guess my question is, when you spoke to the agency about the statistics you have here, what did they say about the fact that the majority were still being resolved at intake at not second, but even third touch with the system?
I don't recall having that specific conversation, and I appreciate you pointing out that we try our best to go into this thing without any bias and not characterize 54% as good or bad. I don't know, and obviously it's different if a kid, the first two times they came in, it was for aggravated assault, and then they come in a third time for a second-degree assault, or a kid that had been truant, fourth-degree burglary, and now a second-degree assault. My guess is it's reasonable that those might be handled differently. But I just want to make sure that it's clear that we try to not have a value judgment about these things. But back to the question, it's not a conversation I remember specifically having. I will say we provided them with an early draft of this report. We had a conversation with them about that. Then we gave them a final draft. They wrote the response that you have in the report to that draft. I don't think this was an issue that came up in any of those conversations.
And final question, Mr. Chairman. You showed a slide about the IDT, which is referred to as the tool in kind of the jargon related to the department. Can you help us understand what the department is measuring when they utilize this tool?
Can I ask Diana? I don't want to put you on the spot. It's in the report, Senator, and I know DJS can speak to it, but if you don't mind, I think Diana has more details, and I think you need to click the button.
You come to the,
Oh, you can come on up.
both sides. Thank you.
Okay. I'm a little shorter than Mike, so it's probably better that I'm standing. I think what this tool is doing is just looking at the risk that a child is probably going to recidivate. It's actually been validated. This most recent IDT has been validated. I think in a study, the department can give you more information about the validation process, but they have updated it multiple times and basically use this as a framework for understanding, is this child at risk of committing another offense. And they can use that tool to kind of guide the decisions that are made in an intake conference. Just to clarify, an intake conference doesn't mean that a child is detained. It could be that 2 days later they come in with their parents and they have a conversation, and they will decide, you know, okay, we have resources already in place. This child is in therapy. We know that there's something going on in the school, and that might actually shape the way that DJS responds through that intake process. So this is mostly just looking at the risk that a child will reoffend.
Right, and I appreciate that. What factors are they utilizing to measure the risk of reoffense?
So there's a set of questionnaires that have scored values, and the questions are things like, does this child have an active court case? Are they currently in the process of delinquency charges for something else? How many previous cases have been upheld by the court? There's a lot of different things in there, but it's, you know, do they have stable housing? Are they attending school regularly? There's, I think, like 13 or 14 questions that are all scored, and then that spits out a final number, and based on that number, they kind of have their framework.
I didn't see that questionnaire in the report. Is
Yeah.
that something you can provide to the committee?
Yeah, we have a copy of it, and DJS also has copies of it on their website.
And really final question here, Mr. Chairman. Of the 14 questions, is the nature of the offense for which the person is in front of the intake officer one of the questions on the
Yeah, so DJS has offense severity guidelines, basically, and based on what the law is, there are some of those offenses that, because of the work you've done, have mandatory decisions that have to be made. So they take that into consideration during the intake.
I know they take it into consideration during intake. Does the risk assessment tool itself, separate from policies related to the underlying offense, does the risk assessment tool itself take into consideration in the scoring the nature of the underlying offense for which the child is in front of the intake officer?
I believe it does, but I would have to go back and verify that.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Good.
Just to clarify one point, for the formal, like the, 54% on the third time for second degree offense, if you go back to that slide.
Yeah.
So obviously, this captures that, the touch point for the second degree offense but the first two offenses or the other interactions with DJS could be for any offense, right?
That's correct.
It could be for
Right, it's not necessarily
Exactly.
third,
second degree.
second degree assault.
It could be carjack. It's all, as is kind of demonstrated by the case histories that you have here. It could be for almost anything.
Yes.
So make sure we have that. All right. Further questions from the committee? All right, I'll end where I started off. Look, it's one of the more difficult challenges for us is just getting good information. And, as we all know, if you ask the right questions, you will sometimes get good information. If you ask the wrong questions, you will always get the wrong answer. You asked a lot of the right questions in this report, and the information is very useful for all of us. So thank you for that public service, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's great. All right. So with that, that'll conclude this portion. We'll now hear from, I believe, the Secretary of the Department of Juvenile Services. Welcome. Thank you for being here with us. You can bring up your panel.
Thank you for having us.
So I know you're in receipt of a number of the questions that we sent ahead of time that are kind of issues that are top of mind. A number of them were brought up in the prior presentation, but
Thank you. And then you can just hit that.
before we get started, say, Mr. Secretary, again, thank you for being here. And I know you and your team have an astronomical job. I mean, a really difficult job. I've talked about to my colleagues how, this is an oil tanker. This isn't a riverine craft. This is something that it takes time to put in place the reforms that are long overdue and to get in there and to diagnose what's happening And so I do appreciate the difficulty of your work and appreciate your efforts. So I just want to set the stage by saying thank you so much for being, you have a very difficult job. And I want to say thank you for willing to step up. And I know that we're going to have a very direct and pointed, cordial conversation. And as I said before, these questions are not to be critical of any individual or the department as a whole, but to make sure that we are set on the right path so that we can make good decisions in partnership with you for the betterment of every Marylander. So I really do appreciate your willingness to come here and spend time with us. So, Mr. Secretary.
Great. Thanks, Senator Smith, Vice Chair Waldstreicher, committee members. I appreciate it. A really interesting conversation and I think an excellent report by the Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability. So I want to share what steps we've taken to address some of the challenges raised there, some of which we had identified even before that, and then discuss our plans for the future. So at the table with me from DJS is Kara Annenson, the Director of Legislation, Policy, and Reform. She will be correcting all of my mistakes today. Maisha Davis, who's our brand new Assistant Secretary of Community Resources, literally week 1. But also with us is Dr. Aaron Betzinger, Research Assistant Professor at University of Maryland School of Social Work's Institute for Innovation and Implementation. They do the risk assessment validation for us, but also importantly, do analysis of our contracted programs, particularly the evidence-based program. So you'll hear more about that from him. Before I start, I want to thank Mike Powell, as I said, and the team for their excellent report. I thought it really was a superior job of analyzing what's going on in the department. So let me start with some steps that we've taken. Let me see, I pressed this button? Yeah. So a few months after I started at DJS, I conducted a listening tour. I went to every county in the state, talked to the judges, the prosecutors, defense attorneys, the police, community members, Department of Social Services. I did that twice last year, and then again this year. I heard over and over and over again that the services available to our young people had atrophied badly during the last decade, prior to 2023. And in fact, I learned that during that decade, instead of shoring up our continuum of services, the department had returned $134 million to the general fund, a little more than $13 million a year. We were giving it back every year rather than going out and buying services. I spoke with Governor Moore and took immediate action, but as you all know, and as you said, this is an oil tanker, not a speedboat. And so you'll hear about the efforts we're making to turn the tanker. So once we talked to these key stakeholders and did the statewide listening tour, we did a whole bunch of different things. One was we applied for and received an $850,000 federal grant to support our efforts from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which is in the Justice Department. We're going to get assistance from national experts to help us conduct a service scan, identify gaps, and they will be very different gaps between Garrett County and Prince George's County and all the different, very diverse counties in the state of Maryland, and then create a feedback process for stakeholders regarding our community service providers and our community service programs. Part of that will be an evaluation not only of the programs that we operate, but of the programs that we refer our young people to that we do not contract for. Simultaneously, we established a position of Assistant Secretary for Community Resources, so we had to get, a PIN reclassified and then go out and recruit. We're very happy that Maisha, who started recently, has come on with us. And that's a role in the department that will focus specifically on community-based services. So we had a Deputy Secretary for Residential and a Deputy Secretary for Community, but that was only focused on probation, and the residential was focused on a residential facility. So now we have somebody exclusively focusing on our community services, and this OPEGA report will greatly inform Maisha's work plan. Although it took time to onboard her, the service gaps were too significant to wait, so we started to immediately take action to fill some of the gaps. And I'm going to highlight 3 areas where we've made progress even as we were designing a more planful approach. That's the Thrive Academy, Services for Girls, and Workforce Development. So my first year at DJS, 42 young people under our supervision were victims or perpetrators of gun violence. One of my previous jobs was Commissioner of Probation in New York City. As you can tell from my accent, I had 30,000 people on probation in New York City. I have 1,500 on probation and aftercare here. I didn't have 42 people get shot or shoot somebody. So it was an extraordinary amount of gun violence that we focused on. And first thing we did was we partnered with the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform and the Casey Foundation. We looked at Mayor Scott's approach to gun violence reduction in Baltimore, which is focused deterrence, and his group violence reduction strategy. The same consultants for them were our consultants, National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. We evaluated 30,000 cases of kids over the previous 3.5 years. Thankfully, 98% of them were not involving gun violence, 2% were. So we looked at what is separating the kids involved in gun violence from the kids not, and then we designed a program to forecast which kids would be most likely to be involved in gun violence and provide them with rigorous services. So using this, we created what we call the Thrive Academy, which is a very intensive community-based program to support youth at risk of gun violence with a specialized case manager, a life coach. Often an individual has gone through similar stuff that the kids have gone. Some of them have committed crimes themselves and have turned their lives around. And they then meet with the young person and their parents, enroll the young person in the program, talk to them about the harm that gun violence can bring both to themselves, to others, and to their families, and then develop an individual life plan for the young people, what we call a suitcase for supports, including stipended employment with local employers or paid service opportunities, assistance with getting to college or vocational training, confidential relocation assistance because some of their families and them are in danger, trauma therapy, and opportunities for pro-social activities like museum trips and ball games and camping. So in the spring of 2023, Governor Moore allocated $2.4 million through ARPA to start that, to kickstart that right away. And then the following year, the General Assembly gave us additional funds to expand that. And we're now in the process. So first we started in just 4 jurisdictions: Anne Arundel, Baltimore County, Prince George's County, and Baltimore City, the 4 jurisdictions that make up 82% of gun violence victims among young people in FY23. So now we're expanding Thrive statewide, but in the first year, only 2% of the young people in the program were gun violence victims. Now, these are kids who are at the highest risk of gun violence on our caseload in the 4 counties that account for 82% of the gun violence in the state of Maryland. So we had 2% of them that were gun violence victims. Thankfully, none were homicide victims, and 4 out of 5 of them did not get arrested for a gun crime. So now we're expanding that statewide with the additional funds the General Assembly gave us. So I kind of want to take you through how that happens. So when you're thinking, why aren't these guys just pressing a button and expanding programs, you get it, right? So what we have is we have a bunch of grassroots groups made up of people, many of whom grew up in those neighborhoods and they got in trouble themselves when they were kids. They're not going to answer a big, thick government RFP. So what we do is we explain to them how they can get a rate set for the services that they are engaged in, how to calculate what this should cost on a daily basis, and then we issue an expression of interest. So we had 2 series of essentially informational sessions and trainings on how to set a rate and how to apply for that rate. That's what we did. 37 groups from around the state, every part of the state, got on the call with us, and they heard us take them through that process. And now, so far, now we've issued 1 expression of interest in December. We're going to do another, and that's about to close. Now we'll do another expression of interest in January. And So far, 7 entities have applied for a rate, and then we're hoping that in January, even more will apply for a rate. When we do that, we'll expand it statewide, and we'll expand it to a different population, kids who are struggling under supervision. 2 is addressing the needs of girls. That's another population that was being underserved. Somebody mentioned the JJMU report. JJMU talked about that. We had already identified that. Girls were in different facilities. My experience is when a girl is in a facility dominated by boys, it's a boys' facility. It's not a girls' facility. So we put all the girls into one facility, trained the staff there, got consultation from experts around the country, the Casey Foundation, Boston University, where there's some of the best work being done, also funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention to give us technical assistance, talk to a bunch of judges, one of whom is in Montgomery County, who's very, very interested, Judge Dumais, about girls' issues, talk to prosecutors, talk to defense attorneys, and now we're issuing this month, within a few days, I think, requests for proposals for a whole continuum of care for girls. But we didn't want to run out and do it because that's when you make mistakes that you have to undo. And once you issue these RFPs, they take a really long time to put together. And so we didn't want to have to pull it and then start all over again. So that's why we did our due diligence up front. So we issued that RFP. Hopefully this year we'll be serving those girls in that continuum. Meanwhile, we're improving at least what happens to those girls when they're in custody. And then finally, workforce development. We had basically no workforce development programs for the kids in DJS. And when you ask a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, and 20-year-old boy, some of them are going to go to college, which is great, and we can help them do that. We can help them figure out how to get Pell Grants, because many of them are eligible for that. We're on that. But a lot of them don't want to go to college, and they don't really, school has not been a good experience for them, and we're going to help them get a GED, but then we got to help them get jobs, and a lot of them, they're not job ready. So they need assistance in order to get the soft skills, know how to show up at work on time with a positive attitude, and frankly, not stoned, right? So that's not nothing for these kids. And so we've done a number of things there. We've partnered with the Maryland Department of Labor and the state's local workforce development boards. And you're going to hear a lot about this going forward because you've heard a lot about us contracting with programs versus not contracting with programs. So when we give money to the workforce development boards in every county in the state, which is what we're doing, or the local management boards, they're not our contracts. So we don't have eyes on them the same exact way we have on our providers. On our providers, we know a lot more, but they're evaluating those programs. And it's not like no one's evaluating the workforce development boards. It's not like no one's evaluating the local management boards. So we contracted for 128 youth employment slots this last summer, and we filled 123 of those 128, and we got 86 year-round slots for in-school and out-of-school youth. We also partner with local reentry navigators from the Department of Labor and youth coordinators at the local one-stops. Very often they weren't serving our kids well. And so we had to sort of talk to them about the special needs of kids in the delinquency system. And now our case managers have much better access there. The Youth Opportunities to Learn Occupations, or YOLO program, the kids named that, not me, was started in our residential facilities because we got all these kids have a high school diploma or a GED in our residential programs, and it wasn't much for them. So they were sitting around watching TV a lot or playing spades. Literally, that was what was happening in the facilities. And that's where, Senator, you'll see a lot of problems. Like several of the senators have mentioned what's happening to direct care staff. When kids are idle, that's when problems happen. We started to employ those kids, and we partnered with the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Environment, who are out in Western Maryland in big numbers. And so now you got kids planting trees, cutting trails, hanging around with the rangers, learning good values from them. and we pay their salaries while they go and do these essentially apprenticeships instead of just sitting around after they get their high school diploma and not going to school. For out-of-youth needing subsidized work, we expanded our Green Cadet program for youth in partnerships with Parks and Rec. So kids in community now are having similar experiences. And then we're partnering to create the Baltimore Vacants Reinvestment Initiative in partnership with Labor, Housing and Community Development, the Maryland Stadium Authority, and local Baltimore stakeholders. You all have given DHCD millions more in dollars to deconstruct and construct housing in the very communities these young people live in. Often those opportunities just pass them by and they go to contractors from not in those communities. So early on, Jake Day and I, Secretary Day and I, got together and designed an apprenticeship program. Then we had to go to all of those entities I just mentioned to get buy-in from them so we could transfer money to some nonprofits that, again, help the kids finish their GEDs and have the workforce skills they need to be employed in those jobs. When that happens, they'll get apprenticeships. Those apprenticeships with the Carpenters Union, who's been super supportive so far, they're like $20 an hour. And then 4 years into it, you're a carpenter. All right, so those are some of the things we've been doing, and I just wanted to sort of give you those examples because none of that's easy. None of that takes no time. I'm not asking for easy, by the way. I didn't take this job because I thought it was going to be easy, and so far it's been delivering. But it does take some time, especially if you're going to do it right. Otherwise, you're redoing it all over and over and over again. All right, so we agree with the auditors that the data collection systems are challenging, and we're creating additional services and programs as needed. We're exploring a new case management system. That CJAMS was not meeting our needs. We feel, I'm not the target audience for this. It's my frontline case managers. They were being driven crazy by CJAMS. They said, we see it coming right now. We got this old system, and we're going to replace it with a system that doesn't work for us. It doesn't give us the functionality we need. And so we sort of met with our colleagues and do it. And now we're getting ready to issue an RFP for an off the shelf or a designed system. We still haven't made that decision final. We think within 18 months to 2 years, we'll have a new system that will have much of the functionality. I don't know where he went. Oh, there you are. Much of the functionality that was addressed in the OPEGA report. In the meantime, we're going to do some shorter term fixes to just at least be able to quantify referrals. Now, I think one thing that's really, really important to know is my reading of the OPEGA report and my careful listening to Mike just now is that there's a difference between what are we quantifying and what is happening. So the system we have now does not allow me to quantify when a kid gets in a fight in school, gets referred to us, we informal that kid, and we refer him to the boys club to be on a basketball team or go to an anger management. We don't quantify that. Now, we put that in the case notes that we did that. And if the young person's on informal supervision, we follow up on that. But Mike can't press a button when he's trying to do an analysis like this to say 47 kids were referred to the boys club and they did great or they did lousy. So that's a problem. He's right about that. So we'll at the very least change our system within the next 90 days to be able to quantify that. But it's still not going to give us, it's still a 25-year-old system. I think people were using Blackberries and pagers back then, if anything. And so, we're gonna get the more modern system, but that's going to take us like 18 months to 2 years. And then the last thing I'll do, I think it's the last thing I'll do. Oh, no, I'm sorry. My apologies. So now we do more in-depth analysis on the evidence-based practices that we've contracted for: multisystemic therapy, functional family therapy, and family-centered therapy. And we will soon be expanding that kind of analysis with the University of Maryland to our Thrive providers. And we're in conversation to expand more to all of our providers, because they do a really excellent job of informing us about the quality of the programs that we contract for. So I'm turning that over to Dr. Betzinger, and he's going to spend as little time as possible, because I see some impatience, explaining that to him.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Aaron Betzinger, a research assistant professor at the Institute for Innovation and Implementation, which is housed within the University of Maryland School of Social Work. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. So the Institute has a long history, 2 decades of providing implementation, training, and evaluation support for community-based services in the state. And this includes not only the work that we do with DJS, but also with DHS, GOCAP, and in our earlier years with the Governor's Office for Children and the Children's Cabinet. For DJS, as the Secretary mentioned, we are currently contracted to provide oversight and monitoring for 2 evidence-based programs. So those are multi-systemic therapy, MST, and functional family therapy, FFT, as well as a promising practice, which is family-centered treatment, FCT. I've provided an acronym cheat sheet here because it's going to get in the weeds with these acronyms. We're also contracted to provide support, as the Secretary mentioned, for credible messenger mentoring models. Those are also referred to as Thrive programs, once those providers are selected and implementation begins. So our implementation support includes providing model overviews, tools, and training to our agency partners, providers, and stakeholders. We also facilitate and document local implementation meetings using a Plan, Do, Study, Act, or PDSA approach, where we help providers and stakeholders identify issues, implement solutions, and assess whether those strategies have had the intended results. And all of what we do depends on good data. So some of the inefficiencies or the lack of data that you all are mentioning here on this panel, we actually do have some of that data, and we use that data to support continuous quality improvement across programs. And what we do is we work with our local providers to create the data collection instruments to collect those data. We get that data from them on a monthly basis, and then our analysts flag any issues with missing or inaccurate data, and we clean that data up with our providers. And after we clean and analyze that data, then we use it. We use it to produce quarterly dashboards, including model-specific and cross-model summary dashboards. And those dashboards, and I'm going to show you some of the data, not in a dashboard format, but some of the data on the next slide, they include information about referrals, admissions to programs, discharge reasons, lengths of stay, and outcomes at discharge, among other indicators. We also review those dashboards in quarterly implementation meetings with our providers, as well as with national program purveyors and our agency partners at DJS. And we use that PDSA approach to, again, identify any issues, come up with strategies to address them, and then assess whether those strategies are having an impact. And those meetings also, of course, allow our providers to share their successes. In addition, we convene semi-annual collaborative meetings to facilitate learning opportunities across our providers, across our different programs as well, and across systems. So we bring both DJS and DHS to the table, because in some instances they're funding these programs for different kids, and that allows cross-system collaboration. And as we've mentioned, or as the Secretary mentioned, in addition to extending implementation, CQI, and dashboarding activities to the new Credible Messenger programs or Thrive programs and potentially other programs, we are also currently planning additional evaluation activities that I think you all will be interested in, that are designed to help DJS assess program efficacy. This means tracking post-discharge arrest outcomes, incorporating DJS risk levels, and creating dashboards that disaggregate data by race, ethnicity, gender, supervision status, and risk level. These efforts are all aimed at allowing us to monitor implementation, identify disparities, assess program effectiveness for different youth subsets, and then ensuring that those services meet both the needs of the department and, more importantly, the individual youth and families that they're serving. Let's see. So the data. So the data I'm showing today is meant to provide a simple overview of some of the indicators that we collect across MST, FFT, and FCT. All of this data represents the most current, or most recent fiscal year, which is FY24, and it's limited in this instance to kids who are served by DJS. So you can see that FFT and FCT received the largest number of referrals, and that is, of course, a result of their wider availability throughout the state. And you can also see the number of admissions for each of these programs, and that number is smaller than the number of referrals. And this is because youth and family engagement can be really challenging. And it's one of the things that our team is constantly working on with DJS staff at the local level, as well as with providers. The next column over, the discharges, program discharges. In this instance, you might see some exceed the number of admissions. That's because some of those youth were admitted in previous years and discharged in the FY24. And not all discharges are successful. And we track and monitor the reasons for discharge across all these programs. And you can see the completion rates here are stronger for the two EBPs, so those being MST and FFT, 87% for MST, 71% for FFT, compared to the lower rate for FCT, which is 36%. I do want to take a second to talk about that lower success rate here, successful completion rate. So FCT's lower successful completion rate is largely attributable to the implementation challenges that we've experienced with a local provider. In consultation with DJS, the FCT Foundation, which is the program's purveyor, did revoke licensure in 2 locations, and a new provider has recently begun implementation in the state. Data from for FCT, I want to also note, comes from the provider's database, which differs from the systems that are used for the 2 EBPs. We're working currently with the FCT Foundation to improve data quality and to better align data collection measures for that program along with the other 2 programs. Across these 3 programs, average lengths of stay are generally higher for youth who complete services than for those who discharge for other reasons. And here I think is what many of you senators are most interested in. So the 2 EBPs, MST and FFT, use the same 3 objective measures for outcomes at discharge, whether the youth is living at home, attending school or working, and if they've had any new arrests while they're in the program. FCT also tracks whether a youth is placed with their family of origin, broadly defined, including circumstances of reunification. FCT's other discharge outcomes reflect the youth and the family's perceptions of improvement. Again, we are working to shift FCT towards using more objective measures for these outcomes at discharge. So looking at these outcomes, the outcomes shown for youth who complete services, which of course are going to be typically more positive than for the kids who discharge for other reasons, are really pretty strong. So youth who complete services, especially in the 2 EBPs, typically have strong outcomes. Most are living at home, most are attending school or working, and few have new arrests. At the same time, we can also see that FCT completers rate the involvement that they've had with FCT very highly as impacting their lives and their goals. I don't want to take too much time. But again, we are working to integrate longer-term arrest data as well. So we will have that recidivism data that you all are asking for. We're connecting it currently to our data with results expected before the end of the fiscal year. I'm, of course, happy to answer any of the questions you have and any follow-up as needed. Thank you.
All right, thank you all very much. I like this format because a lot of what we need to discuss can't be captured on social media or even in the press or like in one article or a press clipping. So this is it's good medium for an extended conversation. So I appreciate the presentation.
So 2 more things before,
yeah,
before I'm done. One is SINs.
Oh yeah.
What's that? Oh, move the slide. Okay. So as was mentioned, SINs are kids primarily who have engaged in behavior that wouldn't be a crime if they were an adult: skipping school, staying out past curfew, disobeying your parents, running away from home are typical. Just interestingly, SINs, running away from home, is the only category of behavior where girls have higher arrest rates than boys, often because they're being sexually molested at home. So SINs cases are or at home or at foster care, wherever it's happening. SINs are a different kind of complex case very often. They're much more social servicey oriented than they are sort of standard kid goes out and steals a car stuff. So when I came on board, there was a lot of concern about the legislation that got passed prior to my arrival, the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, amongst law enforcement, that nothing could be done when a kid under the age of 12 committed a nonviolent offense. And there were press releases and very angry law enforcement officers about a lot of that. But that really wasn't completely true, right? You couldn't arrest them and you couldn't detain them, but there were services we could provide through the SINs process. So what we did was we did 2 rounds of informational sessions, again, in every county in the state. We called them lunch and learns. The primary target was law enforcement, who makes 90+% of the referrals to DJS, but we also included schools and parents just to explain the SINs process. And we think that generated the 9-fold increase in SINs referrals between FY22 and FY24. Some of which was captured in the OPEGA report, but they didn't have the FY24 data. And most of their data really only captures 6 months of my time here. Most of the data in the report predates me. So we did those lunch and learns. The first time we did them, the number of SINs referrals went up, and then the second time, they went up even more. And the arrest rate declined by about a third for kids under the age of 13 who were referred for SINs reports. Senator West, you just sort of started asking about the difference between inputs and outcomes, and the OPEGA report is very input heavy. What widgets did we engage in, and did we track them, right? And they found legitimate gaps there that we're going to work to fix. But the outcomes are recidivism. So the SINs recidivism data are declining, and 92.9% of the kids we divert, next slide. 92.9% of the youth we divert weren't convicted of a new offense after 1 year. SINs kids, it's 89.1% of those kids were not convicted or re-adjudicated for a new offense in a year. And kids on probation, it's 86.5%. And those recidivism rates are declining. There was a big decrease in recidivism for young people on probation between 2017 and 2022. 2022 is the most recent year we have because it has to be a year before you can measure whether a kid recidivated or not. So just to conclude, we inherited a continuum of community services with serious gaps, no program focused on gun violence, very little vocational programming for a population that consistently indicates they want to work, underserving SINs youth, and with a system lacking in serious programmatic oversight and a modern case management tracking system. We launched efforts in all of those areas, receiving additional funds from you at the General Assembly, ARPA, the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and the philanthropic community to expand our continuum and do a better job of monitoring those programs. We've taken steps along the road suggested by the OPEGA report. We agree with their findings, and we're not there yet. But we're on our way to providing the youth in our care with the services they need to turn their lives around, thereby improving public safety and accountability that is, as Governor Morse has stated, data-driven and heart-led. Finally, we would love to have any of you come to our residential programs or just to view any of these services that we have mentioned here today. We're open to giving you all tours. Some of the elected officials who have come away more impressed in some respects because they differ so much from what you often see depicted in the media. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I saw Senator Folden and Senator McKay.
Mr. Secretary, thanks for coming out today. Thank you for your report. I'm sorry I missed some of it. I had to go to testify on a couple other bills. So the recidivism rates you're pointing out, I just want to kind of backtrack from where you came. The recidivism rates you're referencing, that there's a 7% decline, that was before you came in.
Yep.
And that was before the JJRA,
Before the
Juvenile Justice Restoration
Yes,
Act.
correct.
Right? So, and we don't have any data to support anything since then.
You know, it's interesting because you mentioned this before. Is the person who's doing IT, can you come up here and help me change it to one of the graphs? There was somebody that helped me with this, yeah. But sir, go ahead and while she changes it.
Well, I just, you know, when you're talking about the reductions, especially when you're talking about those 13 and under, you know,
Can you go to there, slide.
your numbers aren't actual complete snapshots of what law enforcement's running into, because they're not being detained because they can't be arrested.
Since July, I believe, of 2022, what you're saying is accurate.
Correct. So your numbers decreasing don't hold water because they're decreasing because law enforcement literally cannot do their job based on someone's age.
Got it. And so that's why I wanted her to show you this, because I heard you ask that before. And if what you're saying was true or explained, oops.
No, it has to be the tab that's showing. It should, no.
So I think the basic premise of your question is, and I heard it earlier, that because the JJRA, the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, made it impossible to refer kids for delinquency, that one, number 3, for
Yes, sir.
delinquency cases, we're not getting the full picture, and that explains some of these declines in crime and recidivism. That's essentially the nub of what you're asking, right?
Which graph?
Yes.
It's that one. Okay, so my understanding is,
It moved.
if I'm correct, that, you see my cursor?
Did it go?
The Juvenile Justice Reform Act went into effect in end of, I think it was either June or July of '22.
I don't think this is the chart, though. I think it's the one before that you're going to want to show.
No, this is the one. So if what you're saying explains, like, police can't refer kids because so many of them are unreferable, which is really just the kids under age 13, right? Then we would have expected this referral numbers to go down. but they have not gone down.
They have gone down overall compared to pre-COVID.
Right, but pre-COVID,
That's the comparison.
no, it's not the comparison. The comparison is when the law passed. When the law passed, right? It didn't go down post-COVID because no law was passed in July 20 or July 19.
No, but
That
COVID
affected
happened.
referrals. Since the
But
law passed, it's
COVID
gone up.
COVID happened. Everything dropped off. As we're coming out of COVID, July 2022 is when it came out. There's a change in the types of arrests and those that can be arrested. It may be going up, but it's still lower than where we were before.
So you're saying it would be higher if you didn't pass that law?
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, Senator West and I think Senator
that's-
Smith, you were both on that commission. The number of kids arrested and referred for, remember, this is only nonviolent felonies. That's all it changed. Who are under the age of 13 was pretty small. I mean, you both would remember that more than I would.
Okay.
So yeah, maybe go up.
I don't want to get all, it's fine. I'm going to move on.
Okay.
My point being is that it's not giving a complete accurate picture.
There's
because-
there's no crime statistic that gives the complete picture. Arrests don't give it, referrals don't give it, self-reported crime doesn't give it. Everything's a snapshot.
Okay, so let's go on to the other component then. One of the things that has been pointed out is that when you came in, you decided to get rid of the CJAMS database reporting database and went back to the assist. Can you explain why you decided, after all the years and money that were invested into that program and was being implemented, that one of your first things you did when you came in was went back to a 30-year-old system?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't one of the first things I did. We took a real hard look at CJAMS, and I know you've mentioned several times frontline staff. Really, it was committees of frontline staff people were going through CJAMS, trying to get the functionality out of it that they thought it should provide so that we could do exactly the kind of things recommended in the OPEGA report. And the conclusion was...
When did you get rid of the CJAMS?
We just... Pardon me? Yeah, we never started CJAMS. We were always...
We were training on it.
Observing it.
Were we not? You
we
were
were
training staff
always-
on it. What I'm saying is when did you come in and decide we're no longer going to go down this path?
Sometime last year.
Sometime last year.
And what I'm saying is the reason we decided it was because the staff who were doing it were saying, this is not going to give us the functionality we need to do our jobs. It was
And yet the
kind of a
assist
white
program
elephant.
isn't giving you the functionality we need either.
No, so we're gonna start a new program because CJAMS was a very expensive thing that didn't serve our needs.
Okay. On the recidivism, one of the other things that I've learned is that I believe it was, can you explain why juveniles on probation no longer are urinalysis tested for illicit drugs?
I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. They're no longer routinely randomized if there's no substance abuse issue that's of concern, which is the industry standard. If you don't have somebody that has a drug problem, we're not randomly testing them for drugs.
It's not that they necessarily are arrested for the drug problem, but
Doesn't have to be arrested, yeah. They can have a drug problem that they just tell us about or we learn about from, it doesn't have to be a drug arrest. If a kid's got a drug problem, we test them and we provide them with services.
Wow.
If they don't have a drug problem, we don't test them.
Okay, I don't know that that's actually accurate. So you might need to ask your staff if that's
Okay.
accurate,
I'll
because that's
definitely double check.
that's not what I'm hearing.
I'll double check.
Thank you. And then the staff safety, really important issue here. So important. And this is one of the things that what I'm learning is becoming more and more trouble. Your staffing numbers are down. And we have workers that are being required to work more because the increase on the assaults are up on staff, and thereby you have more workers off on workers' comp. Is that accurate?
No. Our staffing numbers are up. We had a 16% vacancy rate. When I arrived, that's dropped down to 11%. It's even lower for RAs, which are our resident assistants. And then, so that, just on the staffing, I do not know whether our claims for disability are up or down, so I will find that out and get that.
That would be kind of important. And do you know if your assaults on staff are up or down?
Yeah, they're up and down. The Juvenile Justice Monitoring Unit does quarterly reports. Some of them go up, some of them go down, but overall, they haven't changed dramatically from what I understand. But every time JJMU does a report, we do a work plan with frontline staff to try to address violence.
I don't know that you do. That's why I'm asking these questions, Mr. Secretary, because you're trying to tell us here that this is what you do, but I'm being told by these staff that you don't, that you're not taking their input. And when I'm hearing this, it's like, for example, the multiple, for lack of a better term, disturbances that escalated to the requirement to call in local law enforcement and to go in and seize control of the facilities. That's concerning.
That's never happened. Law enforcement.
So state police never went in and never
seized control of my facilities?
Never took it, wasn't called in to resolve and a conflict that was happening between your staff and
A child
children.
called local law enforcement. They came to the facility. We explained to them that there was not a riot. There was no control being taken over by the girls, and they went home.
Do you have video of that facility when all that happened?
Yeah.
We do have video?
Yeah.
And are you monitoring the phone calls that are happening with the children any longer?
We don't tape the phone calls any longer.
Is there a reason we don't do that?
Yes, it is not the industry standard to tape children's phone calls from juvenile facilities.
It's not was it done prior to you being here?
It was.
And so we were doing something contrary to industry standard.
Yes, we were.
And is there anything that's contrary to law that prohibits us?
It is not prohibited.
So my question again is, when we have people that we're only incarcerating those that are having the most egregious actions in our community, we're not feeling that we need to monitor their phone calls, even though measures rises up to the level that they need to be incarcerated.
Right. Again, we're not measuring inputs, we're measuring outcomes. Recidivism's down. And
the recidivism that you're quoting isn't even from when you were here, sir.
Right.
So I wouldn't quote that. You don't have any numbers to support that.
We have numbers that were just given by Dr. Betzinger.
Okay.
But
so, and then
I just want to get one pause. Doug, this is one, it's relevant to your question. So I know you said assaults were up and, in the facilities were up and down. What's the overall trend? Is it trending up, or is it like for the last, I know
it just
month to
depends
month
on
is
the
different.
facility, because, there's
Right.
8 different facilities. Some of them we had real problems with. We replaced the superintendents. We switched around staff. We did work plans to
Across
fix
the
it.
enterprise, though, like, is it up or down?
It's
we
kind
know,
of
I mean,
a little of both. Really kind of goes up and down.
okay, go ahead. Just want to make sure we create a little pause.
But I'll get you the data on it.
No, got it. No, I appreciate that.
So I just have to clarify this. So your answer to the chairman is that when he asked you whether something was up or down, is that a little of both, up and down?
Some are up and some are down.
But overall?
Overall, I believe it's relatively stagnant. I'll get you the data.
All right. And then the last thing I have is there was a report, obviously, that came out, and no one from your staff or the governor's office responded from the report on November, I believe it was 21st last year. Make sure I'm right. November 21st of last year. And in that report, we were talking about some of the things that I'm bringing up, but they also asked about, are the staff members and teens in danger at DJS facilities? And you guys, I guess, didn't answer that, and I'm going to ask you today.
Can you tell me the report you're referring to, sir?
Sure, it's by Fox 45.
Oh, I see. So questions that we received from the media, you're asking me about that?
I'm sorry?
I'm just trying to clarify.
It's a
request for
report that
information
was
from the media.
investigating the claims of assaults on staff, increasing, that there was a lack of control in the facilities, that there was mismanagement on your part, that there was, that it even goes into reference when you went to speak at Harvard Law School last year, and talked about closing prisons because we don't need them, and national end to parole and probation for felons and violent criminals.
So boy, there's a whole bunch in this, so let me.
So
answer
this
the
is
nub
something
of
straight
your
out of a
question.
panel that you were in, so
Sure,
I'm just
Let me
curious.
answer the nub of your question, which is, are people in danger? Was that the essential question?
Are staff
People,
members and
staff
teens
and
in
kids.
danger at DJS facilities? Because the report was not about DJS facilities. It was about your, whatever, the remote, the houses, but this isn't like your Victor Cullens.
Oh,
And
this report even wasn't, correct.
correct. It wasn't about the DJS facilities.
There is no correctional facility in the country that I'm aware of where staff and youth aren't in some level of danger. It's why we train people in those facilities to be able to handle
How are you
confrontations.
training them to handle when someone spits on them or assaults them?
Yep, so
What is
there's
their response supposed to be?
There's a whole range of training. One is to de-escalate. Another is to actually put hands on kids.
Where
so
is
that
the
you
go
can-
hands-on versus?
Are you gonna let me answer the questions, or are you just gonna keep cutting in on me?
Go ahead and finish.
So you've asked, so the people are in danger in juvenile and adult correctional facilities throughout the country. We specifically train staff on how to de-escalate that, on how to put kids into programs so that they're productively occupied, so that that reduces, and ultimately on how to restrain kids. We keep good track of restraints, both physical restraints and mechanical restraints, which we're allowed to do, but which we don't like to do because they're very sort of intrusive and emotional when we do them. But when we have to do them, we do them, and staff are trained to do them. And that's why we tried so much to reduce our vacancy rates, because the more staff we have and the less stressed they are because they've had to work overtime, the better they're going to do.
So is there a matrix in your policy on how staff is to respond when they're assaulted?
No, not a matrix. It's basically, we train the staff on, we got to keep.
That's what I'm saying.
them-
Is there an
It's not a specific.
escalation, de-escalation matrix,
Yeah.
escalation matrix of,
I don't know
that
if
they're
I'd call
supposed
it
to
a
follow?
matrix. I don't know if I call it a matrix, but staff are trained to recognize the antecedents of violence behavior in kids, to try to talk them down, try to separate other kids from them so they don't come
I'm talking
to harm.
specifically when the staff is assaulted.
So I'm sorry, you got to ask the question again. I don't know what you.
Is there some type of training matrix that you have in place that your staff is supposed to follow when they are assaulted by a juvenile? That allows them, because the understanding is, what I'm hearing is there's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking coming from, because there is no matrix in place on how they are to respond when they are assaulted. You're talking about training, you're talking about these other things. Part of that training would be the proper matrix to respond when they are assaulted, because they are being assaulted, sir, and they are not getting properly, you're saying they're being trained, but are they being supported in their training, and are they being backed by you?
They are absolutely being supported and backed, and they are trained. Maybe I'm just stuck on the word matrix, but people are trained on how to deal with.
Is there an
kids
escalation and
acting out.
de-escalation?
Excellent. Senator, I'm gonna just pivot off. I'm gonna come back to you, Senator, but you will get your questions in, don't worry. So we're gonna go to Senator McKay, and then we're gonna go to Senator Henson, and then Senator Love.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I want to switch to placements. So there seems to be a limited number of placements being made, and particularly in the rural areas. I was wondering if you can address that. Is there a philosophy? Is there, at DGS, is there a reason why we're not using resources in the rural areas such as Western Maryland when it comes to placements?
It's a complicated issue. Some of it is just our kids care in some of the rural areas, and some of it is everybody's challenging. Social workers and programs, psychologists in urban and rural areas, but it's a staff in those communities, and they're reaching out to the judges and the prosecutors and defense to get more money to expand our continuum of care. Mostly the way we've done that in rural communities is reach out to the local management boards and the workforce development boards, transfer money to those boards so that they can buy the kinds of services that make sense in Garrett County or Cecil County. We don't have to direct that from Baltimore. So we have transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars to those local management boards, development boards.
So those would be dollars, but what I'm talking about is placement. So is there a understanding that along the 95 corridor, these children that need to be placed, are we not going to put them in rural areas because we have infrastructure out there?
No, I mean, all of our residential programs are in Western Maryland. We don't have them anyplace else. We have Victor Cullen, Greenridge, and Backbone. Backbone's in Garrett.
Correct.
Greenridge is in Washington, and we contract with Cedar Ridge, which is one of our bigger providers. That's in
Correct.
Hagerstown.
And I recently was there
Yeah,
2 weeks
that's
ago.
right. That's right.
So, okay, that answers a little bit there. One of the things that has happened recently, when you talk about vocational programming and those type of stuff, DNR ended up purchasing the Savage River Lodge. They're looking to doing hospitality there. That is going to be an opportunity for your both departments to work together. Not everybody is college bound. Not everybody, God didn't make everybody for that. I'm one of those. And that being the case, there are life skills in workforce. So whether it be in forestry through DNR, whether it be through hospitality, those would be able to give those life skills. And with that, I think that we could then kind of maybe, I know that Garrett Children's Center is temporarily closed, and Backbone's going well and that kind of stuff. But there just seems to be a perception that we don't want to be sending these kids to our western areas for whatever reasons. I know from an educational standpoint, we've got staffing there teaching kids in their home placement and those type of things. I'm not exactly sure home placement is the best place for them. That's not my area of expertise. So I think there's opportunity there. I want to switch a little bit back to assaults on staffing. It may be anecdotal, but Green Ridge Youth Center, I've been contacted that every single staff member has been assaulted. Every single one of them. There is not a single staff member that has not had an assault. And what I'm told is there are no consequences. Giving a kid a laptop or giving a kid a tablet or the ability to go to the mall and buy some shoes. And I mean, my understanding is that, I'm going to call it a P card because I don't know what else to say it, dollars that staff can use to help with that. We're just rewarding these kids with monetary gifts, and there's no consequences to you spit on somebody. And I'm not talking about, there's got to be some form of punishment that there's right and wrong.
Right.
And what I would like to see, if you don't know this number, is what is the percentage of staff in each of these facilities that we're doing that have actually had assaults? I think you're going to find it's very, very high. There's an organization that represents these state workers and staffing, and they have had press conferences to talk about it is just not safe. I have attended those meetings and attended those things, and I have to agree with them. It's just not safe. And so I know that you've used word where depicted in the media, and look, I want you to be successful. I want your department to be successful. but perception is reality. And we can't just continue to be saying, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, well, it's the police that's not doing what they're supposed to do. It's not the courts that aren't supposed to be doing what they're supposed to do. It's not us, DGS, because we've got our hands tied and we can't do the placements and all that kind of stuff. We can't do this anymore. And it is just absolutely mind-boggling that we are doing that. And I'll let you then comment on this last issue. I have been contacted in the last 18 months by 2 grandmothers in Allegheny County that have kids that they can't do anything about, and they're fearful. And juvenile services can't do anything, the court system can't be doing anything, and it literally is, and it's not your individual fault, sir. I just don't know where to tell these people to go. When law enforcement says, I can't lock them up because of the reforms that we've done, I can't ask questions. It's like we're waiting for these kids to make life and death bad choices before we're actually dealing with it. And I'm no expert, but I just need your leadership to reach out, whether it be to the judiciary or end it up to the police. We've got to figure out a way that we can give grandmas and grandparents, what are we going to be doing with these kids that are out of control? They love them. That's not the issue. The issue is there's no one there at the system to be able to do it. And then when they see in the media that staff is being attacked, and it's just, I just don't know the answer to it. And I don't know if you know the answer to it. I'm just sharing with you that frustration.
Well, thank you for all of that. I'll just, there was, again, a lot in there. I'll talk about 2 different things. One is the assaults, right? So, I mean, there's a range of things that can and do happen to kids. And I'm sorry I didn't prepare on this. I thought this was more going to be about the Opega community stuff than it was about the assaults. But I will get the data together and get it to the whole committee.
Thank you.
Soon, by the way, our very thick body of data will be released that we release every year in January. So before the end of this month, we'll be releasing our DRG data resource guide, and you'll all get copies of that. So you'll have a ton of data. But staff can call the police if a kid's assaulted them bad enough. We call the police on kids. We do call the police on kids when they do things. But that's the most extreme thing. We take privileges away, but I think that system is not adequate to the task. And when all of these things were happening, when staff was reaching out to you, they were reaching out to us both directly and through their union leadership. We now have in every one of those Western Maryland facilities a labor management workforce working on exactly this issue. How are we going to hold those kids accountable in ways, again, we're never going to take away a staff member's ability to call the police if they choose to call the police. That's just never going to be, we can't take that away. They have that right. But again, that's going to be this many times. How do we get in front of it on an individual case-by-case basis? And like I said earlier, how do we prevent it from happening in the first place? Staff and management are having that conversation at every one of the facilities. I think what will come out of this is a better behavioral management system. We're looking at several different ones that will never completely eliminate it. But I think that the responses right now that we sort of inherited from the previous administration are inadequate, and we'll make them better. And then we'll evaluate that, and we'll sit down with labor and we'll sit down with frontline staff and improve beyond that. On the case you mentioned about those 2 families, they should totally reach out to us. We don't need a formalization. I mean, one of the things that got mentioned in here, talked about sins, we talked about informally, and we also talked about how long it can sometimes take for kids to get services. Recognize that kids get services faster when we just provide them to them, rather than when we formalize. When we formalize, they have due process rights, and they got lawyers, and then it's going to take some time. But we can provide kids services right away. They don't have to be formally under our supervision, for example, to get the services like multisystemic therapy and family functional therapy that Dr. Betzinger talked about. So please have those people reach out to us. I'll get you the proper contact information after the meeting.
All right, well, I look forward to that. Please take in consideration some of those vocational programming that we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Some opportunities there to be able to get that. And look,
Wrote it down.
when you and I had the conversations during the nomination, look, I may not necessarily understand or agree 100%. I do believe your heart's in the right direction. You're trying to do that, but there's a part of our population in the state of Maryland that just doesn't understand the manner in which you're leading us. And so we need to have a whole, if it's going to be working, the perception's reality.
I agree.
And you've got to somehow be able to reach out to these people and be able to feel comfortable. And when we have staffing that they're being assaulted and where there's no consequences, what you're pitching is not what's being received. And look forward to working with you, sir.
Thanks, Senator McCain.
Thank you,
Appreciate
sir.
it.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your presentation. I didn't have a question for Mr. Powell, so I didn't get a chance to thank him as well for the thorough report and thorough presentation as well. I was very excited for the opportunity to kind of drill down on the portion of what you do that is intake and routing and how someone kind of matriculates through the suite of services that you all offer at DJS. And then particularly excited to see the report talk about your relationship with community partners and the way that you engage people in contractual and non-contractual relationships.
Mm-hmm.
We've had an issue in Anne Arundel County. We had a particular service provider that was very well received, had worked very hard to build trust in the community to be able to be one of your contractual partners. And I'm, of course, not asking you to talk about any specific contract, but their contract was abruptly terminated and the children in Anne Arundel County were routed to services in Prince George's County. They didn't have the same community relationships. Some of the families chose not to continue to engage and participate in what were some very meaningful diversion programs. I reached out to your office because I wanted to gain a better understanding, and even with all of the resources available to me then as delegate, the access available to me then as delegate, I had an incredibly difficult time getting answers to share with those families on why certain decisions were made and what it meant for the future of their children participating in our DJS system. So if there's any way I can uplift the need to just communicate with these families, they are going through an incredibly trying time whenever one of their children finds themselves under the purview of this system. And when decisions are made and they don't have answers and they don't have direction on why, they look to us as leaders to be able to provide that. And when we cannot, it really erodes confidence in the system. And then people wonder if there's going to be meaningful intervention for their children. But I do want to kind of scale up just a little bit and better understand, how are you curating the list of your non-contractual partners? When you look at a place, use Anne Arundel County for an example, and you want to figure out what resources are available, how are you curating that list?
Just a variety of ways. One thing is the staff from these facilities, they don't work out of Baltimore. They all are in every county in the state. So they're generally very aware of the services, supports, and opportunities that are available in the communities they all live in, just like the kids live in them. We also interact with the courts, prosecutors, defense attorneys. All of them have ideas that they contribute to us that we then say, oh, that's a good program, let's go find out about that. And they have lots of ideas. Some the courts themselves contract for as well. So for example, we expanded our use of restorative practices in cases where the victim is interested, maybe something got stolen or broken or something like that. And that was largely through a program that the courts contract for. So there's a whole bunch of ways. The local management boards, so workforce development boards, local care teams, they're all sources of information. And as I think I mentioned earlier, some of them have done evaluations on the programs we refer to kids to that they fund, that we're not evaluating, but they are. So there's a whole variety of ways.
It was great to see the kind of case study from Prince George's County where the report uplifted, really looked like a robust network of resources. How healthy is your system in Anne Arundel County of who you can call to be your non-contractual partners?
Yeah, so we did meet with the county exec specifically on this issue, and the county exec brought together a bunch of folks from the county, from mental health, from social services, prosecutors, defense attorneys. I am never going to say it's completely done, so we're always open to referrals about more ideas. And frankly, we're continuing to issue expressions of interest for these kind of grassroots groups. We will send that to the committee, and if anybody has any ideas, we're totally open. We're constantly scouring the field for new ideas and new opportunities.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, I have a couple of questions. Thank you. I'd like to start picking up, my first two questions actually pick up on questions from my colleague from Western Maryland. The first is you talked about having those lunches to explain the SINS referrals. And I believe that that ties into what my colleague was mentioning about the grandmother and the challenges that she was having that she could call, and that would be a SINS referral. As I'm new to the committee, could you talk to me a little bit more about what that is, what that SINS referral? I know what SINS stands for, but could you tell us a little bit more how an individual or law enforcement or somebody would reach out to you and in what circumstances for this SINS referral?
Great. And just to say it again, so we call them lunch and learns, but they're really just basically informational sessions that we physically went and sat with law enforcement. Law enforcement and teachers and schools are mainly the two biggest sources of SINS referrals, but we opened it up to family members. And some of the law enforcement, some of the teachers would bring family members who they knew were having issues. In each county, we gave the data on what was happening in their county and the specific point person at DJS that they could contact to make the referral, so that it wasn't just, hey, contact some faceless, nameless phone number or email address at DJS if you have a case you want to refer. They got specific information on a specific person relative to their county. We can and will send you the one for each of your counties, so you too have that information. So then imagine that, I don't know, you're a grandmother taking care of your grandchild and they are skipping school constantly and they're starting to get in some fights and you need help. You can reach out to that person and several things will happen, and we will sit down and have a conference with you and the child. We'll assess the situation. We'll score them on the instrument that Dr. Betzinger has helped us develop and revalidate. And then we'll refer them to programs. And sometimes if they need to be referred to court, we'll refer them to court. Just so you know, if we refer them to court, everything sort of slows down there. They're not in a program then. That's why we refer so few SINS kids to court, because we can just get them in a program. And if that's what the family wants, or if that's what the police want, it doesn't require us to go to program. Now, if they refuse, then we take that next step. The report, I think, rightly said that sometimes people refuse or they don't show, and we close the case. We're stopping that practice. I'm not saying we stopped it all at once, but if families just don't show up, that's not a reason to close a case. So we're evolving away from that.
Okay, thank you. Then my next question, I was very interested in when you said you inherited a situation where there had been no workforce development, and then you were working with DNR to work with kids and have them go out with the Rangers in Western Maryland, and then with DHCD in Baltimore to have the kids in their communities work with tearing down and rebuilding houses. I thought that was fascinating. Do you have any other examples? I come from Montgomery County. Is there anything in particular, any department that you're working with in Montgomery County to help the kids that may not be college-bound, that, or even if they are, that can provide those real-life skills for them?
So before last month, we didn't have a head of an assistant secretary for resources, and my director of legislative affairs was doing double duty. So I'm going to, because this is a very specific question to Montgomery County, which is where I live, by the way, as well. So I'm going to ask you to say, because I know we've done some stuff with Montgomery County, I just can't remember all the details, so.
That's okay, we don't need to derail. If you could just get that for me, that would be fantastic.
I kind of wanted to put her on the spot.
That's okay, but I applaud the ingenuity of working with other departments to provide those opportunities for the children. We've talked a lot about the length of time there is to get children placements. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing to reduce that length of time? Because as we know, the sooner the children get access to services, get placements, the better off they will be.
Yes, and so one thing is something you all did, which was last year in HB 814. One of the many provisions that passed in that legislation was to require us to make our decision about what we're doing on a referral in 15 days. That was the average. We were hitting that decision in 15 days, some longer, some less. Now we have to hit them in 15 days. So that's, I think, very positive, and we supported that bit of the legislation as well. So one thing is we'll make the decisions quicker. Really, the other biggest thing is we have to expand the continuum. It's not like my staff don't want the kids in services. They want the kids in services fast, but sometimes there's waiting lists for mental health services, or there's no mentors available for the kids right now, and that just takes a long time. Some of that's a resource issue. Some of that we will ourselves contract for. Some of that we will intergovernmentally transfer the money to the local management boards or the workforce development boards. It just depends on the county and depends on what the issue is. So one example is we used to have in Maryland a robust network of youth service bureaus. And there was a youth service bureau that could service every single county in the state a decade ago. Now there's like 5 of them left, and they're struggling to survive. And those things were really good for SINS kids and diverted kids because they were putting kids into community service type programs or art classes or the kind of stuff, like for the kids that are just at the very shallow end of the pool, they don't necessarily need these expensive therapy programs that Dr. Betzinger described. Some of them just need to be productively engaged because they're sitting on their hands all afternoon after they come home from school, and their mom's a single mom who's working a night job. And they need something they need to be on a football team, or they need to, be in an art class or learn about computers or whatever turns them on. And the youth service bureaus used to do that for the whole state, and they've atrophied over the last decade or so. So the analysis that Assistant Secretary Davis is going to do will be to identify those gaps throughout the state and identify the need in each of those communities, take that data, show it to the courts and the prosecutors and defense attorneys and get their read on it, tell them what we're thinking, get their feedback, and then implement.
Can you explain a little bit more what you mean about they atrophied?
They're gone. I mean, we stopped funding. The state of Maryland stopped funding the youth service bureaus. You might want to meet with, what's Liz's last name? Yeah, I can't remember. Park. Oh, Liz Park, to hear her talk about it. But they used to be funded pretty robustly, and bit by bit by bit, those funds got cut, and so youth service bureaus closed down. But they affected every county in the state at one point.
So that leads into my last question. You opened up with a number of numbers, one of which was 13 million was returned to the general fund, and then there was another number in there. Could you just repeat those for me, please?
Sure. It was $134 million returned over a decade, so it was a little more than 13 million a year. I'm trying to think what the next number was. Was it the 42 kids that were involved in gun violence?
No, it was previous, it was those numbers. It was
Oh, it was
$13 million a
130?
year from what?
Yeah, I don't have that here. I think it was the decade ending right
No,
before I
I
got
mean,
here.
what was that money supposed
Oh,
to be
from-
used for that it wasn't being used for?
Well, I mean, it was in our budget, right? It was in DJS's budget. And so every year, on average, we returned we underspent our budget by about $13 million. At the same time we were doing that, we weren't funding programs. So was it exactly program money? It could have been in other areas too. All I'm saying is that money, as we were giving it back, we could have went out and we could have funded a network of youth service bureaus or mentoring programs or mental health programs. What we did was we gave the money back to the state.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to see you, Mr. Schiraldi.
Good to see you, Senator.
So during your presentation by Dr. Bensinger, I was interested in this discussion of dashboards, and it made me realize that we used to get a really thick compendium from DJS, and I wondered why we haven't received one, and I think you indicated we're going to get it soon.
Soon.
Well, that's good, because I made it my business of reviewing that carefully each year, and it covers lots of the recidivism information that this report doesn't cover.
Correct.
For the reasons I discussed earlier. That's helpful to know. This report, however, was troubling in a number of respects. So let me take you through a couple and ask you to respond to things. On page Roman numeral 8 of the executive summary, which I think is the second page of the executive summary, the report said, and then it's repeated later on, but it's most succinctly stated here. Most youth placed on informal supervision were not placed with the DJS contracted community-based service provider. The agency does not track youth participation with non-contracted vendors. At that point, I wrote in the margin, wow, with an exclamation mark. So it posits a situation in which someone has been referred to the department for a problem. The department places the youth with a non-DJS contracted community-based service provider, and at that point, it's like a black hole because you don't track what happens. And that struck me as irresponsible. So can you respond to this statement made in the report?
Sure. Couple of responses. One is, again, I tried to talk earlier about, are we tracking stuff versus are we tracking it in a way that can be used by a manager to quantify it quickly? We are tracking it mostly, I'm not going to say 100%, but not in a way that I can press a button and say, we referred 57 kids to a youth service bureau in Baltimore County. I couldn't press a button and get that answer because of the antiquated system. We will fix some of that over the next 90 days, so at least we're able to put a list of programs in there that we don't contract with that staff will be required to codify in a way that will allow us to be able to say that we've referred them in a way that I can press a button. But if you go into the case notes on those cases, you will sometimes see that staff referred a kid that was informaled on an assault 2 case to the Boys Club or an anger management program. Sometimes you will not see that. Sometimes that's because they didn't refer a kid there. Sometimes that's because they referred a kid there, but they didn't put it in the case notes.
Well,
And
I assume
know
for
this
each
because-
referral, you have some kind of a file you've opened on that particular youth.
Correct.
And I hope you're trying to tell me that the last entry in that file is not referred to such and such a non-contracted community-based program, and there's no further information about the youth. There must be some information. I did notice somewhere else in the report, you indicate that the report indicates you're not able to do site visits. So you don't actually go out to that non-contractually based organization and take a look at what's going on. So how do you find how the child is progressing in whatever program that community-based organization is undertaking?
Sure. So again, a couple things need to be understood. First of all, sometimes the local management board or the Department of Health or the Workforce Development Board is evaluating those programs. We have not done as good a job as we should about knowing what those evaluations say. So the way this is presented and the way you just presented it was that nobody knows what's happening in these programs. If other governmental entities.
That's the impression I got from the report.
No, understood. Yeah, and I don't mean to characterize I think that's an accurate perception from the report. I don't think that's the truth, and we need to do better on knowing that. I shouldn't pay somebody in Maisha's shop to evaluate a program that the Baltimore County Local Management Board is paying for. Let's say, imagine I transfer $150,000 for workforce development programs to the Baltimore County Local Management Board. They fund that, and they evaluate it. I don't think it's a good use of my money to evaluate it again, unless there's some reason for me to believe that the Baltimore County people aren't doing a good job.
But let's just take juvenile A. So you have a file on juvenile A, and juvenile A was referred to the Baltimore County Boys Club.
Right.
And you're telling me that your file doesn't end. The last entry in the file is not referred to the Baltimore County Boys Club. There is some kind of a follow-up, I assume.
Correct. If the kid's on informal supervision, for
so
example,
you don't do a site visit. What kind of follow-up do you do?
We're learning about the kids. Sometimes we do a site visit. Sometimes staff will have gone there, but that is not currently a requirement. If a kid's on informal supervision, we will be asking the Boys Club, how's little Vinny doing at this program? And that should show up in the case notes.
Okay.
Sometimes when it does not, we discipline staff because they're supposed to be putting that kind of stuff in the case notes. What is not happening is there's not a pull-down menu that a staff member can click on to mandate that they do it. So just so you know, a good case management system, if you're a case manager for me, right, when I'm your client or your subject, you can't close out unless you've checked all the boxes. You cannot close out of, so if you've visited me and you've talked to my mother and you've checked on the program, unless you click on all the pull-down boxes, you can't close the file that day. If you don't close a file, somebody up the chain knows 27% of your cases are not closed, and you're going to have a conversation. And those conversations could end in discipline up to and including termination. Okay. But we don't have that system. That's the future.
Senator West, I want to make sure, just because it's in line with your question, because you're getting there. But so with this, in this line of thinking, so you give that $150,000 to the local jurisdiction, and they're responsible then for evaluating and understanding. So that's, I mean, I think what the question that was missing in your line of question is that, like, so do you review the evaluations? Because, I mean, there has to be some sort of, it seems, okay.
We don't, and that's,
respectfully,
that's where the future is. Yeah,
no,
it's
so
not the present.
respectfully,
Yeah.
like that's I think that's to me what I was reading in the report was like there should be some top level oversight. You know, who's evaluating the evaluators? You know, that type of thing. There's got to be some sort of a level of accountability at your level for the local jurisdictions because that's the money you're providing,
Right.
and so and that's what's coming.
Both because of Assistant Secretary Davis and because of the OJJDP analysis.
Okay.
So one of the things that OJJDP analysis will do is look at all the referrals, right? Where are we sending kids? Who are we sending them through? Like, I think a question came up, and I can't remember who asked it. Who's paying for these people? How are they getting paid?
Yeah.
They're all getting paid by somebody, right? They're getting paid by the health department. They're getting paid by local management boards, local care teams, workforce development boards. Let's look at all of the evaluations for all the places we're sending kids, right? And see, are they being evaluated or not? Are the evaluations showing that they're good or not? And if they're not, then we should have a smaller number of evaluations that we need to require. And then we have to make a decision. Is it worth it for us to pay for an evaluation of an organization we don't fund that we send 6 kids to? Or should we stop sending 6 kids there and send them someplace else? But I don't have all of those answers yet but we will, if we had this hearing next year, you'll have most of those.
So, and that was what was kind of troubling for me in the report, right? Because the language you're using is prospective, and so we wanted to know, hey, so like today, and all for the entire existence of DJS, like it seems as though we have not been evaluating in that fashion, and that's what the report I think highlighted.
So some of it's prospective, and some of it's not, right?
Okay,
So we expanded Thrive, we're doing evaluations of the evidence-based practices that we fund. We're basically, you can't boil the ocean, right? So we're trying to pick priorities. My priority was gun violence. My priority was evaluate the most expensive programs that we're using on the most challenged kids. That's Thrive and all the alphabet soup that Dr. Betzinger talked about, right? So check, right? And now we're going to evaluate Thrive, both through Dr. Betzinger on a more sort of quality assurance basis. We've gotten funding to hire the University of Pennsylvania to do a larger analysis of Thrive. That they're the ones that did the evaluation of Mayor Scott's group violence reduction strategy. We're talking with University of Maryland to evaluate other contractual programs we're engaged in, and we've got the OJJDP process with Assistant Secretary Davis. And we didn't mention this, but the Juvenile Justice Commission that was established under HB 814 is specifically going to have a services committee that we will interact with, so that as these evaluations, so for example, we're sending them the OPEGA report, and as these evaluations get done, we'll be sitting. So we know there's a problem. We're working the problem. We started working the problem with the most serious offenders and the most violent cases. In the meantime, we gave some money to local management boards, and
Yeah, that's what I think that you were teasing out, and I appreciate that. Good.
Okay, let me thank you very much. That was an extremely helpful contribution. Let me just continue and then get you to respond. So the next paragraph says, additionally, DJS oversight of contracted, this is contracted, community-based services has historically been focused on fiscal compliance, not performance. DJS does not systematically audit or validate, and the reports are not well suited for provider-level assessments of performance. And again, I wrote wow in the margin, and the conclusion I came to is that you're checking all the bureaucratic boxes. You're all the way down the list, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this, but you're not trying to figure out whether or not these services that are being provided to the youthful offenders are actually solving a problem. You merely check the box that you put the services together with the offender, period, and wash your hands of what the performance is of the situation. So can you comment to that?
yes. Sometimes I think that's an accurate description, except for the things that Dr. Betzinger talked about. We're doing very deep and thorough analyses of the evidence-based programs. We just contracted with them to do Thrive, and we've got the University of Pennsylvania doing research on that. So we will be expanding that. But yeah, I think that's right. I think that the department I inherited was doing none of this, and we're doing more of it, and we will do even more of it.
Okay. I think you need to do a lot more of it, because I think the public expects that your department is going to take a child who's in trouble and actually solve the problem, not merely check a bunch of boxes.
Understood. And that's, so we talked about inputs and outcomes. I think the outcomes, the good news is that the outcomes are generally pretty good. 9 out of 10 times, kids on probation, SINS kids, and kids who are diverted are not getting a new adjudication within a year. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be evaluating the programs. We should. I agree with you. I agree with the OPEGA report. We're doing more of it, and we need to do even more of it.
I see Senator Waldstreicher has his light on, and I'm sure you're going to talk about page 11 and the table on page 11, which you talked about earlier. So I won't discuss that. Let me go to the case studies. So I got through this long report, and I got back to the case histories, and I've got to say I was appalled. Now, again, as I noted earlier, most of these case histories refer to things that happened under the prior administration, and you weren't there. But the fact that a single individual can come back before your department again and again and again and again and again and again and again in some of these cases, over and over and over on innumerable occasions, and finally on Youth A, after a whole bunch of times, he's placed at the Hickey School and he's there for 6 days. 6 days. And then he comes out, and then there are more and more and more offenses, left me just askance as to what's going on. I would have thought that DJS would, after the first offense or the second offense, or at least the third offense, were to begin to realize there really is a problem here, and we simply can't, that services are not sufficient, that there needs to be a ramp up in how you treat the offender. And I think this is what the public is sensing. I'm getting complaints that people say, you know, he was finally, this kid who's been troubling the neighborhood finally was taken off the street, and the next afternoon he was back troubling the neighborhood again. And then he was taken off the street, and the next day he's back troubling the neighborhood again. So I think there's a general sense abroad that the youthful offenders are not being taken, the problem is not being taken seriously by DJS. And if it simply checks the box, it's done its job, whereas the real job is to turn these kids around.
I totally agree. So, you know, I looked at these histories, and it's hard to know exactly what happened in every single case. I want to qualify that before I say it. But from my review of all, I forget how many cases there were, 15 cases, I only see one kid that was adjudicated delinquent. So I think we all have to remember, like the adult system, we don't skip over the guilt innocence part and get to the sentencing part. So until the kids are sentenced, until they're convicted and sentenced, or in the juvenile parlance, adjudicated delinquent and go to disposition, once the kid's in the system, they have due process rights that are prescribed by you all, by this committee specifically, and we can't order them into services. First of all, we don't order anybody into services, it's the courts that do it. But until they're convicted, they're not gonna get many services.
But these case histories don't seem to suggest they were even taken into juvenile court.
Place them in detention or not place them in detention. And I only saw one kid that was on probation in this whole group. Only one of these kids was ever adjudicated. I'm seeing case dismissed. I'm seeing found not involved. So we don't do that part. We abide by the court's orders. We don't order kids. We don't convict kids. We don't prosecute kids. So when cases are dismissed or kids are found not involved, we don't get to serve them. So
okay, let me ask you about one final thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to my counterpart here. And that is what happened last summer, which was a matter of lots of discussion in the press and among members of the public. And that was the youth in Baltimore City who was put on an ankle monitor, and apparently he got out of the ankle monitor and committed a murder in Howard County, and then later on he was found in a Howard County school carrying a gun, and the Howard County principal hadn't even been told that this youth was a problem youth. And so my first question when I read the article, which never been answered, and I hope you can answer it now, is who was monitoring the monitor? If he cut off his ankle, the whole reason for the ankle monitor is to monitor somebody. So if he cuts it off and goes off and murders somebody in Howard County, why wasn't that picked up by the person monitoring the monitor?
So bunch of things in there.
Yeah.
One is when a kid's on electronic monitor, there's two different kinds. There's a global, I can't talk about individual cases, but I'll talk in generalities that address some of the things that you raised. If the kid's on a global positioning monitor, then we know where they are at all times. If the kid's on electronic monitoring, then we know when they've gone more than a certain number of feet from their home. If they ever cut that off, we immediately call the police. So I can't comment on this individual kid's case, but that's what we do. If you've heard otherwise, that would certainly be an aberration.
So for whatever reason, it didn't happen in this case.
For whatever reason, the media reported that it didn't happen in a case that I can't comment on.
Well,
So
at the very least, the youth had the ability to go out in Howard County and murder somebody.
So if you're on a global positioning device monitor, right, again, I'm not talking about this particular kid's case, that means the judge wants to know where you are, not that you cannot be out. All these kids go to school, some of them have jobs, some of them have therapy programs. If a kid they can be on an electronic monitor, on a global positioning monitor, and commit a crime because they are allowed out of their home. They're not confined in their home, and that's not my decision. That's a decision the judge makes. That is the other question, which I think and I'm really glad you asked that, because I think a lot of people don't understand it. You all have passed pretty good laws, in my view, about what should happen when a kid is either arrested for or convicted for something called a reportable offense, right? There's rules that we, police, prosecutors, can't divulge confidential information about children to schools unless they've committed a list of very serious offenses, and that list comes from you all, right? The rule there is, first of all, DJS can never tell the schools. Well, that's just the most important thing from the standpoint of your question. When a kid is arrested for a reportable offense, the police can and must, according to law, tell the school. Little Johnny's in your school and he just was arrested for X, and then the schools deal with it as they see fit. When the kid is then adjudicated delinquent or convicted for that offense, that responsibility shifts to the state's attorney's office. And they can and must tell the schools, little Johnny was just adjudicated delinquent for this reportable offense. In neither of those circumstances is DJS even allowed to legally tell the schools. So I think people sometimes confuse that because a kid could be on probation. They could have our electronic monitor. It's like, why didn't you tell the school? Because that's not the way it works.
Okay, thank you for your answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and like my colleagues, I kind of want to move deliberately through these with your indulgence. First of all, Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming here today. We are all public servants, and you have dedicated your life to public service, and I appreciate it. You could be doing something much less controversial, much more lucrative, but you're here in front of us today. So let me
Not about the lucrative part, but yeah, certainly much less controversial.
You know, I share my colleagues' terminology. If I were to describe the report in one phrase, it would probably be extremely troubling.
Yeah.
And I want to walk through some elements of the report that you've heard today. A little politics to start. You can't comment, but I will. I think my party was punished a couple of months ago in part because we adopt academic frameworks that sometimes don't make common sense to people. And with that, I wanted to start with your recidivism statistic and what it is and is not reflecting, because I'm concerned that it is not reflecting common sense. When you said 93% of successfully diverted youth don't recidivate.
I said don't have a new conviction or adjudication within a year.
Right. I'm not sure that that reflects the way we would think of recidivation. In other words, if a child committed a first-degree assault, a very serious offense, and then recommitted that same offense within a year, but was either resolved at intake or informaled, that person's second offense would not reflect in your statistic because they were not adjudicated for the second offense. Is that correct?
Correct.
And just so we're on the same page, I guess the question is, do you agree that that doesn't reflect the way people define the word recidivism? If someone does something bad and then does it a second time, most people would say, yes, that person has recidivated.
So done it another time from the standpoint of this august body is an interesting phrase. And I am not a lawyer, and I don't mean to parse, but Senator, when do we define that someone's done something? Upon arrest, upon the prosecutor's decision to prosecute or upon conviction in the United States of America and the state of Maryland? When do we
Just to
define
be
it?
clear, resolved at intake or informal is not a finding by your department that the person did not do the act alleged.
Right, but nor is it a finding that they did the act alleged.
Correct,
Okay.
but because you have informal or resolved at intake, there is no opportunity to determine whether the person did the act alleged. But when you resolve at intake, you are making a determination of services, or if you informal, you are making a determination of services. And so even though a court has not declared that that person is guilty, that's not the phrase we use in juvenile court, your department is essentially saying this person has reoffended. Because it's resolved at intake or because it is informal. And so my point is, if someone does something and then does it again, and you resolve an intake or informal that everyone in this room and everyone watching at home would say that person reoffended. But under your statistic, that behavior is not captured. And I'm worried that that provides an inaccurate description of the frequency with which some children are reoffending because of the way you are categorizing that behavior.
So a number of responses. One is all of those levels. Remember, I mentioned 3 levels. Did the kid get arrested? Did the kid get prosecuted? Did the kid get a new adjudication or conviction? All of that is reported very publicly in the data resource guide. We will physically hand you one this month. They are up online. So it's not like we're hiding that data. I didn't give you every bit of data in that big, thick book today.
So,
one. Two,
yeah, please.
You know, there are implications here well beyond just did a kid get arrested, did a kid do it, right? There are more police in poor neighborhoods that are typically neighborhoods of color than there are in wealthy neighborhoods. Kids can smoke joints in suburban neighborhoods, or they can smoke them on the stoops in Baltimore City. That's the same exact behavior, but the chances that you'll get arrested for one are much higher than that you'll get arrested for another. So part of why, in addition to the fact that, again, in this country, we tend not to think of you as fully having done an act until you're convicted of that act, and there's some problematic elements to sort of thinking otherwise. I understand what you're saying, but it's not a clear-cut thing either way. But part of why we don't do that is because we want courts to look at these cases and decide, did the person really do it or not? And are we fairly assessing that? So we do give all of those data. And then I guess what I would also say is that over time, you can track the changes in those with whatever measure you want. You can see, are we doing better than we did 5 years ago by looking at rearrests, by looking at re-prosecutions, or by looking at re-convictions. Those should smooth out some of your concerns. And then finally, we informal fewer cases. So to the degree that what you're concerned about is problematic, we're doing less of it.
Well, I appreciate everything you said, especially when it comes to racial justice, and I agree with it. I guess my point is, you have said in previous testimony here today that you purposefully don't send children to court because they can get services faster.
And we do that
outside
less
of court.
frequently than my predecessor.
By doing so, but then you are later relying on the inability to make a determination, a formal, final legal determination as to whether someone committed the act or not. You are relying on the fact that those people haven't been adjudicated. When you are choosing not to adjudicate them, I think that's the right policy decision. I just don't think it reflects out in your statistics.
You'll have all the data. And just one other thing, you mentioned this case you were talking about, that the hypothetical was a violent offense. We can't inform those. We can't inform a violent.
Understood. Okay. No, totally get it. So I guess the question then is, I know we're going to get a stack of data from you, but I assume this particular statistic is closer at hand. So if you were to use kind of a common definition of reoffense, how many children who come to you and are either resolved at intake, informal, or formal, then in any way reoffend within the year and are again either resolved at intake or informal?
So you're asking how many get rearrested, essentially?
Correct. And
Not
where you were,
reconvicted. So on the informal reconvictions is 10% and rearrests is 24%.
okay, thank you. That is helpful. I think more accurately describes what people assume to be reoffenses.
So as long as we recognize there's no perfect statistic on that.
Understood. A couple times, this is next question here, but it's a little bit semantics as well. A couple of times you've said today that you are stopping the practice of dismissal for failure to show at intake.
Correct.
But it seemed a curious choice of words, and perhaps I'm reading too much into it, that it's kind of using the active stopping. Like
Stopping.
Have you stopped the practice or have you not stopped?
We're in a process, yeah, so we have to, the way we do anything like this, and this is why it takes a long time to take the vote, is because we do want to sit down with staff, talk about the ramifications of it, how to implement that, right? Then we create policies, then we promulgate those policies to everybody, and then we train them on. So we're somewhere in the middle of that. I don't know exactly
And so
where.
today, if my child committed a second-degree offense and I was informed of an intake conference and I chose not to come to that intake conference with my child, right now, that could be or would be dismissed.
We will do everything we can to get you to come to that, and that might or might not be dismissed because we have not fully implemented. So sometimes we dismiss them, sometimes we refer them.
And what is the timeline for the implementation of
That'll happen
that
within-
policy repeal where people were being dismissed because they didn't come?
Right. That'll happen within the next 90 days.
Okay. We had some discussion of the tool earlier. I stepped out when the doctor was speaking for a hearing in another committee, so if this was covered, please let me know. There has been previous testimony that the tool utilizes 3 primary questions, but we heard today that the tool uses 14 questions. So I guess how many questions are asked on the tool?
So, Senator, I believe you're referring to the intake decision tool. So there's a series of 10 delinquency history questions that are based on the child's official delinquency history. So those are pre-populated by assist, by when the child has been arrested previously, those are scored automatically. Then there's a series of nearly 30 questions that are social history questions that are asked during that intake hearing that are getting into things like, does the child go to school? What are their grades? How are they doing in the community in terms of, do they have a good peer network? Are they associating with delinquent peers? Those kinds of questions. There's, I think, 6 different domains. Mental health is covered. I'm blanking on them now, but they are also published in the Secretary's Data Resource Guide. The whole instrument is published.
Can you just send it kind of separately as a PDF to us so that we can see it?
Sure.
So there's 30 questions. There seemed to be some confusion earlier about the nature of the offense for which the child was before you was one of the questions that was utilized in the tool, in the 30 questions here. And so if someone comes in on a very serious offense, like a rape, like a first-degree assault, is that one of the questions that is utilized within the tool?
So some of the scored items that are currently in the tool are questions that ask about the number of prior misdemeanor and the prior number of felony complaints, and those include the current offense for which the child is before the department.
Okay, so if someone has a series of second-degree assaults, very minor stuff, shoplifting, but the offense for which they are in front of you is very serious, that is weighed.
It is included, it would be included in the number of felonies, for example, if it's a felony that they're talking about.
And so but hold on, you said the number of, I'm asking the nature of. And so
That's correct.
A felony rape is very much different than a felony theft. are you saying the number of felonies is weighed, or are you saying the nature of the
The
felonies?
number of felonies is scored, but the department can't make decisions, as the secretary mentioned, they can't not forward a serious felony complaint like a rape. That will automatically be forwarded to the state's attorney.
Okay, so the nature of the offense is not determined in the way.
The nature of the offense is not scored.
Okay, the
the
number
number
of
is scored.
offenses. Okay, understood.
And just to recognize, we can't, not only can we not informal a rape, we can't informal any even nonviolent felony. So we're only talking about misdemeanors.
Right.
And we're only talking that we can informal, and we're only talking about non-gun misdemeanors.
Okay,
That's all-
understood, yep,
okay.
and I knew that as well, thank you for that. And then I guess the question, just so I understand how the tool works, is each question weighted equally?
So not all of the items are scored. I believe 5 of the delinquency history questions are currently scored, and 6 social history questions are scored. And that's based on their predictive nature. If they're not correlated with recidivism, they're not scored. In those situations, they're just collected for information for case management purposes and to direct referrals, quite frankly. So there's another section of the tool that includes the identified needs and the service referrals that should be made based on those needs.
And so how much is criminal, so criminal history sounds like it's scored. It's scored as to the number, but not as to the nature. How much of the entire questionnaire, what percentage of the questionnaire is weighed based on the person's criminal history?
It's roughly 50%, well, so each item is scored individually.
Okay.
I don't want to misspeak here. So each item is scored individually. The weighting of the scoring is dependent by its predictive nature. And so it could be, one item gets 3 points, another item gets 1 point. It just depends on what the item is.
Right, yeah, so yes, if someone has prior felon, my question is the same as I think where the chairman's going. I'm not sure the question has been answered here. If someone has a number of prior felonies, as a percentage of total score, how much can that add up to? So there are 30 questions. I assume there are perhaps 30 points, or what is the maximum points? And as a percentage of the maximum points, what does criminal history count for?
Yes, I appreciate the question, Senator. I don't remember off the top of my head what the scoring for the items are or what the breakdowns between the risk levels are. I can definitely get you that information.
Okay, that would be wonderful. I want to move on, as Senator West mentioned, to the 3 offenses. The statistic we saw where someone who could have 3, 4, 5 offenses were still being resolved at intake. A majority of them, not all of them. And obviously, as it goes up, it's increasing. But I found it surprising that at the 3rd offense, and perhaps even later, the majority were still being resolved at intake and not more serious action taken, and the danger that poses to the community. So I guess my question is does that statistic reflect the values of your department? Is that your intention, that people who touch 3, 4, 5 times receive a resolved at intake, or do you consider that a concern that you are looking to address within the department?
So a couple of parts to that answer. One is, remember, I'll look at 5 years worth of data, 4.5 years of which predate me, right? And the second part is informally handling cases has declined by 12% since I got here. So actually, that's even not since I got here. That is the end of fiscal year 23. So we're informally fewer cases. So I suspect if that data was 1 year closer, you'd see fewer cases informaled and more cases formalized. Sometimes kids have 3 arrests, none of which have come to us yet. The police do what's called paper referrals on very low-level offenses, and then sometimes all 3 of them arrive at the same time. So a kid was arrested for petty theft on last month. Kid was arrested for resisting arrest another time. Kid just got arrested for that assault too. All three of them, they call them paper referrals, but they come by email, and we draw a conclusion there. Sometimes we, if the family comes and they say, the kid's been having lots of problems, things are going crazy at home, we got him into a program. Sometimes we'll inform of those cases. Again, 92-point-something% of those cases, 9%, 92.9%, aren't getting re-adjudicated for a delinquent act within a year. A year is a long time, by the way, to measure recidivism. Some places only measure it for 90 days on diverted cases. So
let me kind of tie this back to kind of our discussion of common sense. If my son didn't turn in his homework one day, not that big a deal, right? Hey, make sure you got to do your homework. But the second time it happened, I'd say, hey, we're not going to do Xbox for a week. And then the third time, I'd say, hey, maybe there are consequences. We'll take your phone away. I'm not sure that for people listening at home, 3 touches with the system, all with the same level of determination, meaning resolved at intake, reflects what their values are and how they live their lives. I think they would expect an increasing level of accountability as people continued to touch the system and reoffend.
that's right, and we are doing that. That's why we're formalizing more cases. And just to remind you, when we formalize those cases, the overwhelming majority of the times, they get probation, often after months and months and months of due process. So what you gain by formalizing the case, which is some level of supervision for 6 months to a year, if it's a misdemeanor. Right? First of all, when we send those to court, many, many, many of them will get dismissed or steaded or null prost, right? The misdemeanor conviction rates are lower even than felony conviction rates. So I know what you're saying, let's hold them accountable. Don't think that sending them to court holds them accountable more quickly or in some cases ever. And you can look at those cases to see how many of them went away. And they don't go away by us. So if we divert a kid for whatever package of reasons we have to divert them, they'll get services much more quickly. We need to do a better job of expanding those services and monitoring those services. And maybe we need to divert fewer kids, which we are in fact doing. I can't fix it all at once. And many, many, many of the times, we are actually getting the result we hoped to get.
Understood. And last question, Mr. Chairman. I know I utilized a lot of time here today. I want to go back to the case histories and Youth A, especially Youth B. I mean, these ended in indictments by the Attorney General for very serious offenses, right? That was the whole point of the case history. They ended with armed robbery and armed carjacking. I don't want to spend the time to kind of read this into the record, but if you look at Youth A here, it's very troubling. And I guess my question is, as you look at Youth A, which is page 48 if you're seeking it of the report, was this how it's supposed to work? Where are the failures here? How is your department different than what is now than what is reflected over this, what I would describe very troubling and at the end, very violent 5-year period in the life of this child?
Right. So you asked me, is this the way it's supposed to work? And then you made this segue, which a lot of people make, to my department. So let me disabuse you of that, because most of what you're seeing here has nothing to do with my department, right? Case dismissed, intake for this, intake for that. There are almost no convictions. I see one conviction here. Now, maybe I'm reading it wrong, and maybe they didn't put them in here, but I see one of these 15 cases ever got probation. Now, sometimes that's because we diverted them, but look at these cases, a whole bunch of them, we didn't divert, we forwarded them. So I don't know what else happened to them. I don't know if they were dismissed. I don't know if they were steaded. I don't know if they were found not involved. That's not my part of the system. Once they're adjudicated delinquent or convicted and the court sends them to us, then we got to do stuff. And, you know, so you'll see placed on community detention with electronic monitoring or placed at an evening reporting center, but those are all pretrial programs. That's pre-conviction. So they're not curing a kid, they're essentially monitoring a kid. Electronic monitoring tends to be used by the courts when a kid has a viable home to go to. So they'll go home because some parent is going to be there during the evening. They got to go home straight from school. Evening reporting centers very often get used because there's nobody in that home, right? Because mom's working an evening job and dad's not around. So the judge doesn't want to send a kid to that home because even if they're in it, they could be breaking the law. So they'll send them to these evening reporting centers. We literally pick them up from school, drive them to the evening reporting center. They have homework help, computers, you know, we feed them because they're there till 9 o'clock at night, and then we drive them back home. So, but that's not therapy. That is not an attempt to cure them of a behavior they have not yet been convicted of, because that's against the law. And their public defenders would go nuts if we started to do therapy and ask them a bunch of questions and a kid's not convicted yet. And I think that's laws that you guys passed.
I appreciate how much time you've taken with me. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
All right, so we are going to, we are over time here. Senator Love, you want, all right, excellent. All right, so thank you Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. I appreciate your candor and also your willingness to face the shortcomings head on and not dance around that, and to give us a little bit of a window as to the steps you're taking to right the ship, so to speak. Obviously, you know, there is a sense of exigency here, and I appreciate the work that you laid down, and we'll continue to have this dialogue as we go forward. Your success is contingent, you know, and the future reforms we'd like to make is contingent upon your success. And so we look forward to working in partnership with you. We appreciate you taking time to dive deep with us. We did not get a chance to address all the questions that are submitted. I know there are some other questions coming as well. So we're going to submit just kind of an RFI in writing. If you could get back to us, that'd be great as well. And with that, I'd like to say thank you all very much. We are going to start our bill hearings. We're going to take a 5-minute break.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
10-minute break, 10-minute break, 10-minute break, go eat, and we'll come right back. All right. Thank you all.